One lone eye blazing wide with a shocking realization, locked on tight, like the words were forming in silence. A man dropped to his knees, clutching his head like it might shatter, pure disbelief flooding his mind. No way, could this be reincarnation? Then the voice below flashed a question. What was his favorite game? He swallowed hard and answered in his head, I'll handle it like this, and boom, bright visions slammed into him. A shining sword, a mystical orb, and an ancient book. The dungeon brave soul world bursts open, and there they are, cheerful blonde kid, a calm woman in traditional clothes, and a bright-eyed girl, standing together in front of a fancy old building beneath a clear, shining sky. This was the big, spark-you-heart moment, the moment he swore he'd been reincarnated into my favorite game like it was destiny with a grin, and then boom, the whole fantasy kicked off. Magic, another world romance, and a full-on harem with a fresh lineup stepping into the spotlight. Most notably a striking blonde girl and a dark-haired young man who looks eerily like the protagonist, standing ready in front of an incredible academy. Back in his own reality, dressed in a sharp suit now, he stumbled into his apartment and let out a tired sigh, then muttered through clenched teeth about how his day crushed him, the exhaustion screaming in every slumped breath. He slid into his chair in a flash, fingers twitching over the mouse, and then, sorry to make you wait. From now on, it's my time. The earlier fatigue got wiped clean as pure anticipation surged through him. Headphones on, controller gripped tight, he dove into the world of Dungeon Brave Soul, cozy in his room at last, like a total reset after that crushing weariness. Inside the game, the Grand Academy waited with bated breath for a massive day, Slayer Year 101, April 5th, entrance ceremony, where a whole new chapter was about to kick off for its students. Students huddled together, trading greetings and shaky whispers about the entrance ceremony and the exam results. Good morning, someone blurted. You're nervous about the entrance ceremony too? Another asked while someone else fretted over the exam results. Then the narrator snapped in and explained, this is a sword and magic fantasy RPG, and the gamer practically bounced with excitement. Alright, time to enter the 40-second round. He gulped a cool drink, eyes drifting as his love for the game burned on. No matter how many times I play, it never dies, and he credited his unwavering devotion to Dungeon Brave Soul for getting him through even his rotten workplace, where a brief peek showed him stuck behind a boring desk, grinding like it was just another quest. He pictured Dungeon Brave Soul, where Leon Price, the main guy in class, suddenly finds himself packed in by a sea of female students all trying to win his attention. And he knows the whole thrill of the game is how it lets you build real bonds with each heroine, all the way toward romance. In this wild game world, a teacher stood in front of the class, ready to call out the entrance exam winners, and Leon Prez, alongside Nagisa Seikai, Aerith Sintraka, Shell Uranus, and that stern-looking guy, all held their breath as the results inched closer. Back in his own reality, headphones blaring and drink in hand, the protagonist grinned wide, so locked into the game he could barely contain himself, itching for the next jaw-dropping clue about that tangled, incredible world. He kept playing, curled up in the cozy comfort of his room, while the game unveiled the four main characters, faces that would soon steer the entire story. Then the game zoomed in on two of the standout legends, Shell Uranus, who snagged 5th in the entrance exam and started his journey as a mage, and Nagisa Seikai, who took 4th place and kicked things off as a swordsman. Trailing right behind them was Aerith Sintraka, 3rd in the entrance exam, already blazing a path as a cleric, her soft smile standing in brutal contrast to the trials waiting just ahead. Finally, the game dropped Leon Price on us, the undeniable class topper from the entrance exam, labeled a spellblade, and then revealed the real bombshell. He's a hero's descendant and the story's true protagonist. He finally realized the whole game was built around one mission: seize control of Leon, get closer and closer to the heroines, and then, when the time is right, march straight into a showdown with the terrifying Demon King. And that's just the core. There are tons of side events, big and tiny. Some fans already know, others people only whisper about, and together they make the whole experience feel packed with depth. As the story pushed forward, Dungeon Brave Soul didn't just move the plot, it shifted the heroine's outfit visuals, delivering jaw-dropping, beautifully detailed art, and he realized that this stunning visual punch, paired with one more major factor, was exactly why the game racked up such massive sales. He figured the real reason it blew up was simple. It was rated for adults, so Leon could get way more up close with the heroines in a dangerously intimate, suggestive way. He got totally hooked by the game's promise, raising a harem, watching his cheeks burn as he pictured himself paired up with the in-game lead, Leon Prey, and heroines like Aerith Sintraka. Yeah, the game basically told you that boosting your bond with the heroines feels insanely heart-melting, but he couldn't shake the thought that it might be less mind-blowing than it sounds, even with Leon getting surrounded by a whole lineup of gorgeous women like Shell Uranus, Nagisa Sekai, and the rest. The game Danbori blew up so hard it spawned anime, manga, and a mountain of merchandise, hitting audiences everywhere. And it all came down to how perfectly it balanced legit RPG thrills with spicy, erotic edge, the exact combo that made the adulterated version go crazy. Even though the game practically begged him to stay, he groaned in pure frustration and rubbed his temple, because he knew it had everything he'd ever want, even if he hadn't mapped it all out yet. He kept rubbing his head in his hands, fighting through a wave of exhaustion as Fantasy Male 2 and the two female students carried on their story on screen, completely ignoring how drained he felt. At last, exhaustion crushed him and he surrendered, collapsing onto the floor beside his gaming setup, surrounded by the wreckage of his long session. A lone figure in dark, billowing fabric stands in this grand hall, staring into the silence, then blurs the question, "What game do you dislike?" This question kicks us straight into the world of Dungeon Brave Soul 2 ***, where the guy who was a total nobody in the first story, barely even named, now steps into the spotlight as Xenon**, the main protagonist. We watch him trade words with Leon** as the tale picks up right after Leon sealed the Demon King. In this second game, you slip into Xenon's boots and blast through a world now shackled by brutal chains, then the story suddenly twists and pulls the rug out from under you. Xenon, as he barrels toward Leon, clicks with him so fast it turns into instant trouble. Then he starts winning over the heroines one by one until he's gathered them all into a ruthless party. As the days drag on, the group's vibe flips hard. Those heroines who used to stick close to Leon slowly pull away, cutting ties right in front of him. That creepy shift happened because Xenon was quietly yanking the heroines one by one, then sitting back on top of them like he owned the place and proving it with every smug breath. Cornered with nowhere to run, Leon is left helpless as Xenon shows his true cruelty, revealing the heroine he has taken and tormenting her right in front of Leon's own eyes. The heroine's face twists in pure agony and terror as she gasps for air and screams, begging whoever's hurting her to stop. Leon's own face crumples with crushing despair, tears burning in his eyes as he extends a shaking hand, completely helpless to stop it. Cornered by a tragedy that crushes him, Leon snaps into a final, desperate move. He tears open the ancient seal of the Demon King, then turns and strides into a pitch-black cave, chasing a way out with power no one was meant to touch. A blinding explosion of light tore through the sky and the world's final collapse hit like a hammer, because the Demon King finally unleashed his full, unstoppable power. The protagonist snapped back to the game that spawned this wreckage, Dungeon Brave Soul 2, and suddenly it all made sense. A twisted love and war story where Leon, the original hero, got brutalized by Xenon, the new guy who swooped in and stole his heroines, and the disgust hit him hard. He swore he'd never relive it again. He reached out with trembling fingers, and this weird, unfamiliar feeling washed over him as he slowly started to wake up. Then he snapped to his surroundings. This wasn't his room at all, it was a lavish palace, and the body in front of him looked ripped, lean, and unreal. He couldn't stop asking where he was, or why his physique had been remade so brutally. Even with the chaos swirling, he couldn't stop himself from soaking in every lavish detail, the kind of luxury you just couldn't miss. He strode toward the grand, ornate mirror, locking eyes with the reflection that was about to stare back. As he closed the distance, his reflection started to form, until it surfaced with a face that was definitely not his. He stared at that unfamiliar face, eyes bulging with pure shock because it wasn't his reflection at all. It was a whole different person. His stomach dropped the second he locked eyes with his own reflection, Xenon Baskerville, the one villain from Dambor he hated more than anything. Then he snapped, screaming in terror while clutching his head like it was splitting open. Blindsided by the truth, he dropped to his knees as despair flooded in, because he didn't get to reincarnate as his beloved hero. No, he woke up as the villain he swore he'd never be in his favorite game. And the moment his new life as Xenon Baskerville started, the real story kicked off. He jolted awake with a start, only to find Xenon Baskerville staring him down, the one guy he hated with his whole soul, and suddenly he wasn't just a former player anymore. He was trapped inside Dungeon Brave's soul, living out Dembare, the story he loved most. He stared at this cruel twist of fate and couldn't believe it. He'd been reborn as this guy. Swamped by it all, he just gave up and tried to steal a few more seconds of sleep, dropping to the floor beside a low table packed with gaming gear, the whole thing screaming your old life in every piece. He couldn't stop wondering what kind of cruelty you'd have to unleash in a past life to get reborn as the kind of man who goes hunting for women, because that label sure seems to show up before Xenon ever does, and in his memory, 2 female students are already clinging to him. If reincarnation was truly his fate, he would have begged for the role of Leon, the real hero, because Leon gets adored by admiring female students all the time, while Xenon's name is dragged through the mud. Just as his thoughts were about to take over, a maid burst into his room without permission and froze him in shock. Then she stumbled over apologies nonstop, begging him to forgive her. The maid kept trembling with regret, blurting that he never woke up even when she knocked, so she panicked and slipped in without waiting. Then she bowed so deeply she looked ready to take any punishment for her rudeness and messy appearance. He choked on a gasp, pure shock and total confusion, because the maid stayed frozen in her deep bow like she was waiting for punishment to finally land. She insisted she was ready, then dared him to punish her the way he always did, while he froze inside, stunned by what as usual really meant, and terrified that the first Xenon might have been doing daily violence, maybe even whipping her every single day. He snapped at her to shove her clothes back on, seething at Xenon's disgusting way of thinking and praying his doing nothing wouldn't make him look guilty. When the maid blinked in shock, she nodded and promised she'd obey, warning that if this was really normal, he'd have to bark that order at least 10 times. Then he swore hard that he wouldn't lay a hand on her just for getting dressed. Moments later, the maid, fully dressed now, thanked him for staying put, and he raised a set of dark clothes, making it clear they were Xenon's for sure. He stared at the maid a little longer, and bam, her breathtaking beauty hit him hard, making him wonder how someone this captivating got stuck in the game's shadows, so he snapped back to the moment and asked what date it was right now. With one finger softly pressed to her lips, the maid told him it was April 5th, 101 on the Slayer calendar, and that answer snapped everything into place. He was, no doubt about it, trapped in the world of Dambor. He stared at April 5th like it burned into his mind, because in the royal capital, it was the day the Royal Academy of Sword and Magic kicked off its entrance ceremony, and for him, since he'd already finished the game, that date was stamped into memory. The chief inquirer of Zenon Sama weighed his next move and then skipped morning training altogether, firing back that from this day on, he'd start showing up at the academy. Demate blurted out her shock because Xenon always kicked off training every single morning like clockwork. At the same time, the protagonist clenched his hand and a twisting vortex of dark energy roared to life, and it hit him. The Xenon in the original wasn't just some familiar face. He had a disciplined, hard-working drive and powers the Dambore 2 never showed. The maid offered to whip up breakfast if he'd take a breather from training, but he shot it down, saying he'd press on as usual, and demanded she guide him straight to the training grounds. As he trailed the maid, he scanned every corner like a hawk. This place was straight out of the game, and he couldn't stop asking himself what kind of training ground Xenon was really being forged in. He started sword training and felt his body click into Xenon's physical rhythm, like he'd been swinging this exact form since the day he was born. He locked onto the training targets and it hit him. Xenon's martial arts skills weren't just talent, they were pure force beyond explanation, and then, with a sharp focus, he drove forward and unleashed a brutal dark blade attack. Dark blade slammed into its target with savage power, tearing it apart into a storm of fragments. He kept digging into Xenon's past, wondering how a guy this devoted turned into a villain who stole other men's women, and he couldn't deny the brutal mastery of the advanced dark magic Xenon wielded. So he realized the original Xenon must have trained for ages in both swordsmanship and spells, and he swore that as long as he lived in this body, he'd learn every single thing about him. A brutal realization hit him. Xenon's awful reputation wasn't magic at all, it was his womanizing. But right now he hadn't snatched a single woman, and the Royal Academy's entrance ceremony was happening today. So he decided, not yet, I've got no reason to hate him yet. Then his mind snapped to the future. Now that he'd become Xenon, he swore he'd dodge every messy scandal that crushed the game's sequel version of him. He pictured an easy school life, wondering if he should back the protagonist in the fight against the Demon King, or play it safe and steer clear of all danger. Right then, a maid rolled up and offered him a glass of water, and he took it with a grateful nod. It was exactly the kind of relief he needed. Meanwhile, Leviena the maid leaned around the corner, eyes blazing wide in shock at the totally unexpected interaction. He spun toward her bare-chested and demanded why she'd just gone still, while Leviana, shaken to the core, tried to wrap her head around the fact that Zenon-sama wasn't rejecting her at all. She was actually grateful. Leviana snapped at herself, calling Zenon a horrible person for stirring up emotions like that, then forced her breathing steady and begged herself to pull it together. He locked eyes with her and spilled out his heartfelt thanks for her steady devotion, finally confessing he'd been too shy to say it until this moment. Leviana blushed so hard she could only gasp in stunned surprise. Flooded with panic, she clapped both hands over her mouth as tears spilled into her eyes, while he, on the other side, hammered a vow into his chest. He wouldn't become a villain like Zenon, the original, and he'd change his heart and his actions before it was too late. Leviana sobbed with pure joy, shouting that this was the best day of her life and that her devotion had finally paid off, only for him to gently take her hands, admit it was his fault for not thanking her sooner, and swear he'd truly appreciate her starting right now. Still trembling with tears, she declared her loyalty to her young master would never waver. Later, Zenon, now in his school uniform, got ready to roll out in a fancy grand carriage, and Leviana, still shaking with emotion, planted a heartfelt goodbye on his lips and begged him to stay safe. Zenon caught himself thinking her reaction came way too easily, then immediately warned his own thoughts that he couldn't slip into the kind of villain who'd take love like that for granted, while an elderly butler just watched from the side, eyes sharp and silent. The moment the carriage lurched into motion, Leviana threw her arms up and waved like crazy, yelling at the top of her lungs for her young master to come back safe and unhurt, while the butler stood there perfectly steady and calm, and Zenon, sitting by the window, just watched with a quiet, unshaken smile. He dragged out a tired sigh, stuck in his head with one burning question: how much of the original game's story should he really let run its course? From this day forward, the entrance ceremony kicks the whole thing into motion. Dambor's story finally starts to roar. Leon Brave, the protagonist, is locked in for 2 years at the academy, teaming up with the heroines to take down the Demon King. As he wrestled with what it meant to be just another classmate, he drilled down on how deep his role in the main story would go, and he made one vow: he'd never let the heroine get cheated on, and he'd never steal someone else's girlfriend. Your love was the rule. His mind wandered straight into the shadowy sequel, Dambore 2***, where Leon, the hero who once sealed the Demon King, gets stabbed in the back by Zenon**, who snatches the heroine away, and that single betrayal drives Leon to one terrifying choice: resurrect the Demon King. When the Demon King gets resurrected, massive magic will tear loose, wrecking the royal capital and everyone inside it, and sealing a brutal, catastrophic ending for all. He figured the whole tragedy could be stopped cold if he just quit stealing women. Then he vowed to sit tight and wait for Leon to beat the Demon King, ignoring his character's scripted fate in the game like it was nothing. With a fierce stare, he swore he'd never tread Zenon's original path. He'd carved out a brand new fate, one that shattered the game's script. A towering, ornate gate, carved with the words Royal Academy of Sword and Magic, stood wide open, and there it was, inviting a group of students in as they rushed to the entrance, dwarfed by the massive architecture, ready to kick off their whole academic adventure. He clenched his fists, a wild grin cracking across his face, and shouted that this was the academy, the place where brave souls get forged, because he'd been waiting for this moment for ages, and now it was here, and he burst out, "All right, let's go." The academy stretched out like a masterpiece, grand domes and carved facades glowing under the sun, while students flooded the grounds, turning the courtyards and grand staircases into a non-stop swirl of youthful energy. As he strode through the school hallways he'd mapped out 1,000 times in his head, an ugly, unexpected nervousness hit him like a wave, and he immediately started berating himself for it, calling it pathetic to feel that scared for someone like him. He forced himself to calm down, feeling his power dip as the first rush of excitement faded. Then it didn't last, because the second he spotted Leon, the hero of this world, his eyes went wide and he sucked in a sharp breath. He stared at the scene, a sly grin curling on his lips as the game's plot flashed back in his head. First the entrance ceremony in the auditorium, then a class orientation, then the girls would pull Leon into a social gathering where he'd finally get close to the heroines, until a sudden violent outburst cut his thoughts short, and he blurted a warning that everyone shouldn't be so scared, even while his own face contorted into raw, panicked desperation. His face twisted into a terrifying grin, eyes bulging, pupils blown wide, and the 2 female students nearby snapped back with a terrified gasp, hands flying to their mouths in pure shock, but he didn't even notice, already swallowed up by his own head. The 2 girls, still rattled to the core, insisted it wasn't their fault at all, it was completely on him, while he stormed off with his back turned, grimly admitting he'd have to be more careful and stop laughing so insanely in front of people from now on. He was stuck alone in that giant auditorium, hemmed in by rows of empty seats, and it hit him like a punch. He couldn't escape the isolation. He dragged his hand over his face, let out a heavy sigh, and grimly thought about his part in all this. He was Zenon Baskerville, the villain, the brutal cuckold, and even with nobody around, he insisted he wasn't lonely. He leaned in, eyes locked on the elderly butler as he stood before the assembled students and declared he was about to reveal the entrance exam's top performers. Then the butler boomed out the fifth-place winner, Shell Uranus, and that young woman, grinning so bright and with a feather perched in her hair, beamed with pure pride as she accepted her moment. She was a frontier noble's daughter, a mage who specialized in deadly offensive spells, and as Leon's childhood friend, she pushed him to finally enroll in the academy. Next, the butler boomed the announcement for the fourth-place winner, Nagisa Sekai, and the moment her name hit the air, she blushed hard, heart pounding like crazy. She came from a Japanese-style land, raised as the dojo master's daughter and a true samurai girl, then stepped into battle as a speed-slashing swordswoman so lethal it even outshined Leon's. The protagonist watched her closely, sensing the dark weight sitting in her heart, because that's the missing piece he'd need later for his conquest. Then the butler called out the third-place winner, Aerith Centria. Born into central nobility, her father was a cardinal, and she moved with the kind of church-trained grace that runs deep in her bones. She flashed a confident smile, gripping her staff, and the protagonist couldn't help thinking she looked perfectly composed. Then the butler boomed out the Academy's runner-up, the second-place winner, Zenon Baskerville, and Zenon just smirked because the world where Aerith would be dragged down, body and soul, by him, that nightmare was finally dead. He kept blushing as regrets crashed in. Every main heroine was ridiculously cute, and part of him wanted to join their orbit, but the villain in him froze, not knowing what to do next. The butler snapped, shouting Zenon Baskerville's name one more time, impatiently, like he couldn't wait another second. Zenon jolted in panic, groaning as he realized he'd blown his moment to stand up, while the other students in the auditorium edged toward their seats. He stayed seated, panic hammering his thoughts as it hit him. His second-place ranking had dragged unwanted eyes his way. Whispers swirled through the students about the infamous basketball family, their rumored links to a criminal guild, and even the previous king, while the headmaster, an elegant old man, stepped forward to tell the whole assembly that at the Royal Sword and Magic Academy, nobles and commoners were equal, and anyone who acted disrespectfully wouldn't be allowed to get away with it. Then it hit him, jolting hard, that he'd stood up too late, and that mistake made everything even more awkward. The headmaster just stared at him like he was measuring every second. Even with his head spinning, he forced himself to stay seated, because he feared one careless slip would brand him a target for bullying. Then he tossed out a sarcastic apology for his rudeness, promised he'd heed the headmaster's advice, and flashed a sneaky, slightly villainous smirk like he meant every word. A crushing silence slammed into the assembly hall, tension buzzing in every breath, as every eye pinned that defiant student in place. Meanwhile, the heroines Shell Uranus, Nagisa Sekai, and Aerith Centria lean in, watching every twist of the drama unfold. The headmaster, stone-faced, accepted Zenon's apology, but it sounded too cheeky for comfort, and he pressed him hard. Did Zenon really mean to change his rebellious attitude at all? Zenon internally panicked, shouting that he'd already apologized, swearing that despite his villain look, he was actually a good guy. With a sharp little cough, the headmaster announced that since it was a celebration, he'd let them off the hook for now, but then his eyes hardened and he warned that if things didn't improve, he couldn't promise what would happen next. Zenon snapped back with a startled gasp. Still stinging from that reprimand and the timing he botched, he couldn't stop asking what he'd done wrong. Then the headmaster snapped his attention elsewhere, calling out Leon Bray as the first-place achiever and class president. Leon Brave, born the hero's child, carries the one true power to seal the Demon King, so yeah, he's the real, ultimate protagonist. Even as a commoner, he crushes school with top grades, turns heads everywhere, and he's a sun-kissed blonde heartthrob. But it all kicks off when he lands his first job as a Rune Knight, a super-rare class that mixes brutal close-range fighting with magic, so rare the game's lore only mentions 2 of them. He locked eyes with Zenon, and even Zenon couldn't help wondering if that stare meant pure animosity, because he hadn't done anything to earn hate, not even something like stealing a heroines, and then it hit him like a lightning bolt. The real protagonist from every game he'd ever played was standing right in front of him. Moments later, the headmaster pointed at Leon and ordered him to deliver the new student representatives' greeting, Leon nodded calmly, stepped up, and faced the whole assembly to speak. As Leon kicked off his speech, he swallowed pride and admitted he'd started as a backwoods commoner, then lit up with pure awe at the chance to stand before the Royal Sword and Magic Academy. He thanked the faculty, the mentors he hadn't met yet, and especially his guardians and Count Uranus, who'd powered his whole journey. Meanwhile, Xenon couldn't stop worrying that his earlier chaos might have crushed Leon's feelings, even though he insisted it was never on purpose. He pressed on, saying the real reason he'd come to the academy was to forge his strength and stand guard over the nation. And while he admitted the Slayer Kingdom was enjoying peace, he still snapped that peace didn't mean evil was gone. It meant evil was waiting to be crushed. Xenon listened closely, but honestly that speech felt a little flat to him, like he'd been expecting a way bigger Hero King-level bombshell. Leon slammed his fist down to finish his declaration, and the students around them erupted in murmurs. Xenon froze, caught off guard, and blurted out a shocked "Ha." Silence crashed down, and Leon's eyes narrowed like a laser, locked in on something only he could see. Leon's razor-sharp eyes snapped straight to Xenon, then Xenon jolted back in pure shock, panicking to himself, "Why is Leon going after him like this when he's done nothing wrong yet?" Xenon stared at the game, Dambor 3, and realized he was just a background extra. He remembered how the hero from Dambor 2, LJ, had flipped overnight into a villain protagonist with a whole brand new backstory, and he couldn't shake the thought. Was that brutal change in the game's world the reason Leon started turning cold and hostile toward him, even while Xenon hadn't lifted a finger? He kept grinding through his thoughts, sick to his stomach at the terrifying idea, if Leon got beaten by the Demon King, the whole world could get wiped clean. He realized no matter what plan they started with, there was zero guarantee Leon would actually beat the Demon King, or that this story would ever end in a happy ending. When the school ceremony finally wrapped up, everyone got herded toward their classrooms, and Xenon sat there, lost in thought, watching the whole classroom buzz around him. He realized that if the world had truly shifted, all his game instincts might suddenly stop working, so he ditched his old stay quiet, just survive plan and now knew he'd have to go all in. He swore not to mess with Leon on a whim and instead push for the one thing he wanted most, a peaceful school life. While Xenon kept mulling things over, Leon, sitting right there, let out a frustrated grunt, like Xenon's very presence meant he'd messed up somehow, while Xenon turned the question over and over, hunting for a more dependable way to pull off his plans. He pictured himself teaming up with Leon and the others after the Demon King finally fell, backing them up until they could enjoy a safe school life instead of watching the world burn, and he knew exactly how strong he was, calling himself the deadliest character right under Leon and the Demon King. A female teacher watched Xenon like a hawk, convinced she could keep him wholesome and locked onto the main scenario, no matter what he'd just done. Meanwhile, Xenon couldn't stop replaying the question in his head. Why on earth had he acted like that in the first place? Right after school wrapped, the halls buzzed with talk about clubs. Leon even asked how to join, and the others pushed for a meeting. Xenon watched it all like it was a show and thought, humans decide what they like in seconds. Then he smirked at the real reason people stared, his marquee family look, infamous across the whole kingdom. He sprinted back home on instinct, ready to cook up a fresh strategy for the storm coming next, because his life had thrown him curveballs he never saw coming. When he rolled up, a grand carriage stopped at the towering Baskerville mansion, and the moment he stepped out, the place erupted with voices welcoming their young master back home. Moments later, Leviana the maid burst to his side, fretting over how he'd vanished in the cold, then snapped, "Your father, my lord, is waiting," and urged him to rush to the office right now. The name Grandolph Baskerville hit him like a jolt. Mention his father, and fear flickered across his face as his expression snapped tight. Grandolph Baskerville was Xenon's father, Night's cold ruler in that kingdom, the mastermind who pushed Xenon down a road soaked in evil. He ran the underworld like it was his kingdom, commanded a massive crime guild, lined his pockets by trafficking slaves, and turned murder into a business by steering assassins like puppets and swallowing every truth in darkness. So even the game's own lore screams just how legendary and ruthless his villainy really was. Even though he wanted nothing to do with someone like that, he couldn't dodge the truth. His father was coming, no way around it. So he let out a heavy sigh, swallowed the sting in his chest, and marched into the office, announcing himself the moment he stepped inside. He slipped inside, and then out of nowhere, dark magic chains burst from the floor, snapping around him with brutal, crushing force. That move was called *bloody chain***. It hit fast, it hit hard. Brutal chains snapped tight around him, yanked him to the ground, and left him sprawled there, completely helpless. He fought the magical bonds with everything he had, choking on sharp pain as a shadowy figure hovered over him, cold, familiar, and terrifying, and it growled, "Fossum tempo meu filho," naming him like it already owned the truth. Randolph Baskerville towered over him and told him straight, that dark magic with the bloody chain didn't just bind, it strangled him and dealt painful hits off and on like pure torture, and then he casually asked how Xenon did on the entrance exam, mentioning he'd landed in second place. He kept ripping into Xenon, steaming with deep disappointment that his own son couldn't even claw his way to the top rank in a minor academy. Then he snapped that the Baskerville family, masters of the night, would never swallow defeat, claiming Xenon had basically traded their pride away with pure foolishness. Xenon was still chained up, writhing in brutal pain, barely managing to make a sound. Still disappointed, he snapped at Xenon that if he didn't snag first place in the next exam, this punishment wouldn't be the end, then ordered him to obey the stewards to the letter and stay locked in on training before he headed off to his own work. Moments after Grandolph stormed out, Levina burst into the room, eyes bulging with pure terror, because Xenon was wrecked, chained tight by a vicious, bloody chain. She screamed his name, rushing to him, pleading for him to stay with her while swearing he'd get medical help right away. Levina shot a powerful healing potion into Xenon, who was sprawled, bleeding out and barely holding onto consciousness, his body wrecked by that brutal attack. Later, Xenon jolted awake in his bed and stared at the huge Baskerville mansion under the night sky. Then relief hit hard when he realized the brutal damage crawling across his body was fading fast, proving that potion was nothing short of miraculous. Then he finally spotted Leviana. She'd already fallen asleep right beside him, her head resting softly on the bed, completely spent from everything she'd done to care for him. Xenon stared at Leviana's unstoppable kindness and couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would someone that pure ever end up serving a depraved bastard like him, the kind who steals other people's lovers? Then the memory of his father's abuse and torture clawed back in, and that old pain still burned the moment he even tried to forget it. Then his mind snapped to Grandolph Baskerville. He blamed him without a doubt for how Xenon spiraled into madness in the first place, convinced it was Grandolph's cruelty that ground Xenon's sanity into dust. He finally understood that Xenon's mental collapse didn't come out of nowhere. It was the daily abuse and crushing burdens breaking him, until his warped mind snapped and he viciously framed Leon and kidnapped the heroine. Xenon sank deeper into his own boiling envy of Leon, every bit of what Xenon lacked, from the love of countless heroines to classmates who actually admired him, to adults celebrating him for bringing down the Demon King. Xenon, born into a hated family and spat on by other students, endured abuse and never once felt a father's love, so Leon became the maddening reminder of everything Xenon wanted and everything he could never have. He kept replaying Xenon's first twisted life in his head, remembering how he'd ripped every heroine away from Leon, and even Aerith Centria was caught sobbing, crushed by the original Xenon's selfish hunger. With a determined glint blazing in his eyes, he clenched his fist and locked in his decision, setting a new, unshakable goal in this world. Then his mind snapped to that shadowy monster of a person, someone he swore had to be crushed, even before he ever got to the Demon King. That was Grandolph, his own father, smiling like he knew exactly what was coming, and Xenon snapped that he was a dead-set enemy who had no right to exist, locking in his mission to finally destroy him. He swore to tear up the whole scripted fate and even defy the evil leader's father too, and after being reborn, he promised he'd live wild and free, savoring this world his way. Right as his resolve turned steel, Levina the maid burst into his room, shocked to see him awake, her cheeks flushed with surprise and relief. She instantly lunged into him, crushing him in a tight hug, her face pressed to his chest as she whispered his name over and over, and he totally lost it, overwhelmed and flustered from the sheer wave of affection. Leviana blurted out his name in pure shock, still clinging to him as he stood there visibly rattled, and then the world snapped to a jaw-dropping view, the massive, intimidating Baskerville estate looming beneath a sky packed with stars. Later, Xenon sprawled into a quiet corner of that fancy room, alone at a tiny table, scratching furiously in his notebook while his brow knit tight with pure focus. First, he had to slam-check everything he already knew about this world, scrambling through quests and locations in his notebook, writing every detail down so he'd be ready for the road ahead. He carefully jotted every bit of what he knew, mapping the whole unfolding situation and the exact info he had to grab next. then chose to write it all in Japanese so it would hit clear and be easy for him to find and use. With his first notes finally done, he leaned back and stared at what came next, how to truly live in this world. Pride hit him hard, and he was convinced his preparations were more than enough for now. He knew his dream wouldn't survive unless he crushed the one standing in his way, his own father, Randolph, and that sly, sinister smirk haunted his thoughts like a taunt from the monster he'd have to face. As he kept planning, Leon's mind snapped to what would happen if he broke the script, because one wrong move would make his life a total wild card and turn everything into chaos. He even thought about slipping out the front door, but the second the thought landed, he slammed it down. The streets were packed with gangsters and assassins, and getting away wasn't an option. His face tightened as the truth hit like a punch. If Leon, the hero, ever fell to the Demon King, the whole world would vanish. He wished the Demon King could be sealed up for good, but the fate of everyone crushed down on his shoulders like a mountain. He stared into the world's core, feeling how it all worked. Leon, the destined hero, standing at the center while heroines swarmed him and forged bonds that wouldn't snap, and he finally got it. Leon was the magnet pulling everyone in, while his own role as the main character would be the lonely leftover, left behind to sob, staring at the bitter contrast between his emptiness and the hero's endless popularity. Lying in bed, the protagonist stared at the ceiling, realizing the only way to get truly stronger was to master fresh skills and sharpen the ones he already had. Then he slammed his status screen on. Boom, a hologram popped into the air, flashing that he was Xenon Baskerville, working as a magic swordsman with a sword skill rating of 20. He realized his real-life job matched his game role. He was a magic swordsman, just like Leon, and he also figured out this world didn't run on normal levels. You got stronger by grinding up your skill proficiency. As he pushed deeper, he uncovered the truth. His sword skills were stuck at 20, his dark magic was also 20, and even his training sat at 22, and the moment he saw it, confusion spilled out of him in a low, stunned murmur. He finally got why swordplay and dark magic demanded the same level of skill, but the jump in his training threw him off, because part of him prayed he'd never need dark magic, and he still couldn't wrap his head around how its proficiency had climbed so fast. He instantly realized this status screen wasn't the game at all. It stripped away every command he knew, with no items, no settings, and no save or load, like it was showing him a blunt truth he couldn't mess with. He decided he had to grab the right items and cram in new skills to level up his fighting, and he noticed combat skills were still stuck at max value 0, meaning pure, explosive growth was waiting. Then it clicked. Push a few skills to the right level, and that would unlock routes to climb out of his starting class into the next ranks. His mind snapped to one thing: gear. A sharp weapon, sturdy armor, and the right equipment could crank up his stats, while special items handed him fresh skills and even magic. Then came accessories and damage-cutting talismans, and he was dead set on grabbing every last one. Then he started weighing every way to snag those must-have items, buy them from shops, risk his life in brutal dungeons, or earn them as prizes for beating the right events. He weighed his options, forgetting what he needed. Dungeon loot hit you with pure randomness and unreliable odds, but the truly rare stuff only showed up in auctions, and those bids could drain a fortune. He didn't plan to follow the script word for word, but he knew he couldn't slow Leon down, because that would crash everything into disaster. He kept wondering if those special event items were supposed to be handed to Leon every time, terrified that one careless "sure, take this" could end with Leon getting crushed by the Demon King. A gentle knock rippled through the lavish room, and right after it came a courteous voice, asking permission to step inside. Moments later, Leviana, his maid, burst in with a tray piled high with breakfast, worried he might be sick, and she'd brought it straight to him. When she spoke, relief hit him hard. He confessed he was getting hungry fast, and he praised how the coffee, sandwich, and soup would set him right. He thanked her for the meal, and the moment it landed, her cheeks burst into a full-blown blush as she blurted that she hadn't earned his gratitude at all. She'd just been doing a maid's job. Still, he pressed his thanks again, praising the way she always looked after him. While Leviano sipped her coffee in calm silence, suddenly she snapped, covering her face with her hand as a helpless little sound of distress slipped out. She snapped out an apology, bolted from the room, and swore she'd be back later for the plates. And as she slipped out, he saw blood splatter across the floor in the exact spot where she'd just been standing. He could barely wrap his head around it. His simple thanks had lit her up so hard she actually got a nosebleed, and now her wild, intense devotion both scared him and, shockingly, made him cherish it more than he'd ever admit. After that, still in his school uniform, he strode through the grand halls, smugly realizing he finally had real allies and didn't have to fall back on desperate moves. Then Zealous, the old butler, stepped up and bowed with a respectful greeting. He immediately grilled whether Zeli's planned to rat out his laziness to his father, and Zeli snapped back that his worry came from Xenon skipping morning practice in the garden. He was just checking if he was okay, reminding Xenon that as the estate's head butler, he still had duties to handle. He stood face to face with the old butler, who delivered Lord Baskerville's razor-sharp expectations for Xenon grow into a powerful, one-of-a-kind man who could carry the family name with pride, and please, don't crush those hopes. Xenon promised him he'd meet his father's expectations, even if training forced him to take a breather sometimes, so there was nothing to worry about. Then the butler stared downward and Xenon flicked his head a little, letting out a quiet, unmistakable huff. With a fire in his eyes, he snapped that swinging practice wasn't the only road to strength, and that he'd get strong enough to shock his father in his own way. Then, right before he left, the butler grilled him for his plan to power up. 1 week later, Xenon stormed onto the academy grounds, and the air itself seemed to grow colder as his menacing aura sparked whispers from every corner, while Leon stared at him with open, burning hatred. Xenon didn't even blink, convinced that middle school lessons were a joke and that magic was something he carried inside himself, popping into his mind with effortless ease. As he sat in class, anticipation clawed at his chest for the lesson he'd been waiting for. Then the female teacher lit the room up by announcing, "Today's subject, dungeon exploration." Xenon just flashed a sly, knowing smile, while some classmates practically shrank with fear. Teacher told everyone to team up before they stepped into danger, and Xenon leaned in like every word mattered. Because dungeons weren't just creepy rooms, they were monster-filled lairs stacked with treasure for endless resources, naturally spawning both monsters and riches. But if nobody kept watch, they'd turn into ticking bombs, flooding the world with even more monsters. This academy was built for one brutal purpose: wipe out the monsters trapped inside these dungeons and forge humans strong enough to guard everyone's lives. Right at the start, a massive ornate door, choked with vines, loomed like a warning, marking the entrance to yet another deadly nightmare. Right at the colossal entrance, the teacher declared that everyone's party would step into the dungeon one after another, and pointed to Sage's playground, the academy's tutorial dungeon. Xenon, sword finally in hand, took his stance and braced himself to go in. He stood there, chin up, saying he could handle the tutorial dungeon alone, no party needed. The female teacher watched him with a tight, worried face, like his solo plan didn't sit right with her, and a sharp sting in her nose gave away just how uneasy she felt. Xenon shot a quick look over his shoulder, making it crystal clear he was ready to keep going solo with zero issues. Nagisa Sekai, the student who always distrusts people at first and hates getting close, loitered by the dungeon entrance. Because the chronicler already saw it coming, Leon would help her and she'd finally open up. Meanwhile, the teacher watched her with worry and shot a warning across the air: going into a dungeon alone is deadly, especially for a first-timer. Even after the teacher warned Xenon, he brushed it off and said teaming up was totally unnecessary. Nagisa privately fumed that she needed to keep her distance from the main hero, Leon, and keep their contact to a bare minimum. The teacher let out a heavy sigh and hit them again with the academy's rules. If a student dies, the school won't take the blame at all, so don't go acting reckless. Yeah, the dungeon doesn't hold any truly nasty monsters, but if anything happens, it's on the student. She drove the lesson home, telling the hungry students their dungeon run would decide their grades, right when parties started screaming for the doors to open. As she spoke, the students went wild, talking over each other, screaming about who got the next turn and who would be first to sprint into the action. Chaos kept erupting as students shoved and begged to be first, and Xenon just watched it all, clocking how desperate they were to dive into the dungeon, like the teacher might pick the order at any second. He leaned toward Nagisa and muttered that the other students looked way too carefree and reckless, like stepping into a dungeon was no more than a fun little outing. Nagisa Sekai stepped up to him, grilled him about what he was doing and pointed out he looked like the only one with nothing to do, then whipped around to the total chaos crowd and snapped that if nobody could pick who goes first, she'd take the lead, leaving Xenon wondering if she was daring to outshine him. With a hard, determined stride, she marched forward and made it clear she was going to lead, while Xenon watched her bold move and joked that she surprisingly had a great personality, and the other students exploded, shouting that what she was doing was unfair. She charged forward with full intent, and in seconds her silhouette had already vanished into the pitch-black, stone-lined corridor of the tutorial dungeon, while the other students stayed stuck at the entrance, staring as she disappeared. Meanwhile, the rest of the students kept spiraling into chaos, some snapping at Nagisa for being selfish, others screaming that the whole situation was rigged. Zenon watched them stall and explode, lashing out that their constant indecision was just wasting time while the sun was already sliding toward the horizon. Then he slammed down the choice: make up your minds, rock, paper, scissors, or a lottery right now. After his explosive outburst, Leon flashed a happy wave and shouted that it was their turn, then they were gone. The teacher, who'd been watching the whole time, marched up to Zenon, stunned by how he'd suddenly taken the lead, and grilled him. Was he really rethinking that decision, like he'd known nothing at all? She kept talking, admitting that as his teacher she had to dig deep and face what was really happening, because the students were keeping their distance from him, judging him by his looks and his family name, and she confessed she'd done the exact same thing once too. Then he swung back to her and said, "Before we go in, there's one thing I've got to confirm about the order." She shot back, "You didn't even play rock, paper, scissors either, so are you really allowed to be last?" While they talked, Zenon's mind slipped into the dungeon's depths. He could practically see a treasure chest and a shining sword waiting inside, and then the big question hit: would anything he hauled out be taxed too? The teacher told him this dungeon was just a school-run lesson, so the loot wouldn't bring a single tax. Then she warned the prizes were barely worth a coin, even if you sold them, and there weren't any real monsters, so deaths were practically unheard of. Zenon felt his shoulders drop and swore he'd scour for anything useful, but she finished by saying that since he was alone, he should bolt the moment danger hit. He nodded at her worries, saying he genuinely appreciated it, especially since it was coming from the teacher everyone talked about like she was hated. He even figured she was solid, a genuinely good teacher. But then a creepy thought hit him hard. In the game, she was the woman who got punished in a basement and came out as a dog. He clenched his fist and felt his resolve lock in tight. No way he'd ever let that fate from Yandere 2 catch up to him. With a sinister grin, Zenon announced it was time to take over the dungeon. Then he strode into the pitch-black corridor, back to the entrance, braced to meet whatever horror waited ahead. The young man clenched his resolve and launched into a savage flurry of fast, razor-precise hits. His blade flashed like a dark blur as he triggered his shadow edge power, and the bouncing slime creature splintered apart under the assault. He pushed forward without mercy, his 2 swords carving massive, sweeping arcs as they sliced straight through the dungeon corridor's thick, jiggly monsters. After wiping out a whole pack of those creatures, he stopped dead, eyes blazing as he stared at a tiny crystal object that had fallen from one of them. Then it hit him. The dungeon's layout and the loot it spat out were weirdly identical to the game he already knew inside out. His mind drifted to what this place really was, just a tutorial dungeon, so he knew the monsters would be weak, the traps wouldn't be tricky, and he could push through it alone without breaking a sweat. He burst back into the battle with fresh fire, a blur of motion as he carved straight through the oncoming wave of slimes. He scooped up the fallen stuff without breaking a sweat, but one worry kept gnawing at him. Down on the bottom floor, the real monster was waiting. He shrugged off the current foes as Mare's little snacks, then sprang into the air, blade blazing, as he carved through the bouncing, gelatinous monsters, knowing their numbers meant nothing once he was in control. He kept launching his aerial attacks, a smug smirk glued to his lips, and swore the slimes were nothing but punching bags he'd used to drill his training. As he hit the ground, a last slime detonated in a gooey splash, plastering his face with sticky mess, yet his smirk never vanished, pure proof he was loving every second of this fight. He pushed deeper into the dungeon, and a soft, ghost-like ribbon of energy curled behind him down the stone steps. He let out a quiet thought. Now it was time to smash through to the next floor. His face tightened the second he hit the second floor, a small frown snapping into place and pressing hard into his brow. When he finally hit the second floor, he spotted a small crowd. Leon, sprawled and grimacing, hurt bad, while Shell and Nagisa rushed to his side. Leon choked out how weak he felt after getting wrecked even by minor enemies in his first dungeon, but he swallowed the shame and accepted his fate. He pushed forward, dragging the wounded out of sight, and burst into a huge cavern where the floor was packed with broken slime bodies, each one sprawled lifeless as he swung his sword and carved a path straight through. As he pushed onward, he spotted the toll of bodies on the third floor rising fast. Then his eyes locked onto Leon, Shell, and Nagisa sprawled against the dungeon walls, hurt but alive, and he realized they were the only students who'd claw their way this far down. Leon, Shell, and Nagisa collapsed against the brutal stone wall, wrecked and bleeding, their faces screaming just how hard that dungeon had hit them. Shell tried to heal Leon and shot off her worries, warning that if they were going to team up later, they needed to think about what they did outside school, and Leon stared at her, his mind spiraling into the idea of a cheat skill class, then scoffed at the thought of partnering with brainless idiots who'd only weigh him down. Out of nowhere, a new woman stepped in, long blonde hair, Aerith, and she unleashed healing magic like it was nothing, her touch snapping the injured students, including Leon, Shell, and Nagisa, back to relief while they stared in awe at her seemingly endless mana. He froze with eyes blazing wide, surprise crashing in and something else lurking underneath, as Aerith kept healing, calm and radiant like pure, unstoppable peace. He snapped himself out of it with a hard slap to his own face, swearing he'd never fall for distractions again, because becoming an NTR protagonist would ruin the chances of Demon King resurrection. He refused to let that be the ending, no matter what. Then he spun his back on Aerith and the whole crew, shoved his fear aside, and pushed himself forward. He'd pulled away from his classmates, and just like that, a familiar figure slid up to him, Aerith asking straight out, "So you're really Baskerville-sama?" While the other students stared with bated breath, Aerith snapped her identity, junior student basketball-sama, into place, and then he stepped up and revealed he was Country-san, the academy's third-place standout. He immediately grilled her about why she was in the tutorial dungeon and what she was doing there. Then she flashed a calm, gentle smile and offered him healing, like she already expected him to refuse. She swore she'd never falter, she'd never leave the hurt behind, and she was going to heal everyone, no matter what. Aerith Baskerville-sama was, as the chronicler swore, the living definition of dedication. She'd keep throwing herself into danger to save people in the game's darkest moments. And when the protagonist noticed her staying put, he pressed her for why, only for her to stay calm and say she'd already been given the go-ahead by her friends. Her job was to heal the party first. Inside his own head, he dismissed it all as her being too buddy-buddy and way too naive. Her self-sacrificing kindness hit him like a punch, and it filled his chest with the same gut-twisting fear he remembered from the game's story. He stared at the kind of people who'd throw themselves in front of danger to save others, even if it cost them their own happiness, and while he didn't think she was a bad person, her selfless choices still drove him up the wall. He turned his back and strode away, thinking her self-sacrifice was ridiculous, and he decided it wasn't his job to scold her. He'd leave that to the hero instead. She shouted after him, asking if something was wrong, but he only told her to keep helping people, just don't overdo it, then slipped back into the quiet alone, descending by himself. He tightened his resolve and told himself the truth. Saving Aerith, the wounded saint, wasn't his fate, not when Leon had that job. He'd chosen to play the villain, not the hero, and he planned to drop off this stage in a blaze of glory, leaving the heroic work to everyone else. He plunged deeper into the dungeon, the passage squeezing into a twisting stairway that dropped straight into the black darkness below. On the fourth floor, a pack of horned beasts barreled forward. Right behind them, shadowy figures surged in with pure, terrifying intent. He kept trudging alone, and it hit him. Leon, Shell, and Nagisa were probably already down on the lowest floor, while every other classmate was stuck up top where they belonged. He flashed back to a brutal, dragon-like monster, one Leon had probably already wiped out, proof that this hero was built different. When he stepped into that huge, echoing new cavern packed with squirmy blob creatures, a sharp wave of disappointment hit him. Was this really his first dungeon? So he gripped his sword and got ready to swing. Suddenly, a jittery voice screamed, and then the rocks started breaking apart. Right after that came a panicked plea to back up fast, a brutal warning that death would strike if they didn't move, and without thinking, he bolted straight for the collapsing wall. He burst onto the scene of chaos, eyes snapping wide when he spotted two of his classmates, one injured and barely holding on, and a girl fighting desperately to keep both of them safe. Looming over them was a monstrous gargoyle, one that, as far as he knew, should have been trapped to the dungeon's very lowest floor. The injured male student sobbed in pure agony, shouting at the gargoyle for what it did to Alicia, while the gargoyle bellowed that it was going to slaughter humans, and he watched the whole disaster unfold, remembering that Leon, Seal, and Nagisa were supposed to face the same monster on the lowest floor, with Leon unleashing his heroic blood to drive it back. It hit him like a punch. His whole assumption was wrong, because the truth he'd missed was this. The gargoyle wasn't just attacking, it had already escaped from somewhere, a detail the game's lore slips in for a second, and now it was mowing down classmates as it tore through the upper floors. A bolt of vision slammed into his head, Leon, Seal, and Alicia, staring at him with shock and worry etched across their faces. The vision exploded in intensity, showing Leon clutching his dying classmate, his voice cracking with pure agony as he tore into himself for letting the enemy slip away and for the death that followed. While Leon crumpled in grief, a dark-haired man stepped in and loomed over them, saying mob characters were forced to die and that Leon was next. The moment the scene cut in, a monstrous demon smashed into Leon, filling the whole cavern with its towering bulk. Far off, the dark-haired man watched in silence, smug as he believed Leon's pain and even his death had to happen to sharpen his growth and ignite a raw, burning hatred for the demon race. As the vision kept rolling, the protagonist wrestled with one brutal truth: if he reached out, he could twist the timeline where Leon ends up defeating the Demon King and saving the world, and that crushed him. It was heartbreaking, but he forced himself to look away from the tragedy unfolding before his eyes. But in that vision, as the dark-haired man turned to go, Leon's desperate plea screamed after him, begging him to flee, swearing it was already too late for Leon, while the dark-haired man's fist tightened and you could see the war inside him flicker across his face. Out of nowhere, the vision ripped apart and snapped them back to reality. Then the gargoyle unleashed a brutal burst of energy, slamming Leon and Seal back so hard they thought it was the end, until a stranger stepped forward and swallowed the attack. Standing rock solid, the protagonist faced down the roaring gargoyle, then declared, voice steeled with purpose, that being a villain just wasn't his path before charging in to take the monster on. Baskerville stood his ground in front of a monstrous demon, swearing that a real hero wouldn't leave their classmates behind, and that danger wouldn't stop them from getting stronger. The demon's rage erupted into a brutal roar, daring him to try escaping, like it could never let him slip away. And far off, a mysterious woman watched the whole clash unfold. Baskerville only laughed at the demon's threat, sneering that it was just a tutorial boss with no business talking big. Then he burst forward and slammed into a brutal attack. He rocketed through the sky, grinning like he couldn't be stopped, declaring himself the greatest villain and daring even the protagonist to try. Then he turned on the demon, smirking that some lowly mob monster couldn't block him, and ordered it to die for his glory. His assault kept hammering on, heavy blows crashing into the demon and blasting debris into the air, while the creature screamed in agony, and through it all, Baskerville clocked the wild part: it was still standing strong. Still locked in the fight, he snapped in irritation, because this gargoyle was packing the muscle of monsters you usually meet way later in the mid-game, and calling it a stiff wooden doll, like it was nothing, was the only way he could keep his cool. He tried to pull off an ability called Shadow Edge, but his rusty starting sword clanged uselessly. He couldn't land even one real hit, and the demon just kept roaring like it hadn't felt a thing. While the demon soared, he clocked its massive physical stats, but then he spotted the crack: its magic resistance was low. A fresh plan lit up in his mind, yet the strain hit hard. Injuries spread across his face as he wondered how many magic blasts it would take to finally bring this monster down. The demon shot forward, roaring like it wanted blood, and he knew this kind of foe was built for a whole party, not a lone player, and it crushed him that he was stuck alone. With fresh fire in his chest, he vowed to end the fight with one flawless critical hit, because he'd finally cracked the demon's weakness and planned to unleash it. He spotted the one deadly weakness, then slammed in with a brutal strike, smashing through the gargoyle and drawing a savage roar as he shouted, "It's right here." The world's rules forced every enemy to have one clear weak spot, and for that gargoyle it sat right under its chin. Hit there and you'd land a guaranteed critical. The gargoyle staggered from the hit, then sneered, asking how it must feel for an event boss to get taken down by someone beneath it, especially after it kept botching revenge on the hero. All it could manage was a harsh, guttural acknowledgement that the human was right there. Suddenly, the gargoyle gasped in shock, then lashed out with a brutal health flare in a last-ditch counterattack. Even with that brutal strike, the gargoyle's body started cracking apart, then it exploded into a final, blood-curdling shriek as it got completely obliterated. Once that gargoyle was wiped out, he stared at his next steps and went, "This is my lane," because the magic swordsman is the strongest starting job in this world. The same road Leon took too, and there was simply no way he could lose to some puny event boss like that. Then he gathered the wreckage of the defeated monster, admitting this was the first real fight he'd landed since coming to this world, and calling it his victory. He wondered what would happen to the story after taking down the event monster, then chose to celebrate the fact he'd saved a life that the original game story had already decided would die. After that, his gaze snapped to the distant silhouettes. As he closed in on the group, he spotted Character F crouching over someone injured on the ground, and he burst out, "Hey, are you all right?" The character looked up, confirmed they were okay, and poured out their gratitude to Baskerville for pulling them through that dire situation. As the character runners talked, he snapped his hand toward a bunch of empty potion bottles strewn across the ground, his face tightening as he realized they were burning through all their healing potions fast. He jolted and stared up when Baskerville thrust out a hand, dropping healing items in his reach. Then Baskerville snapped, reminding him they were the only thing that mattered in their desperate situation. He snatched the potions and shoved one into Alicia right away. She was badly hurt, but Baskerville waved it off, saying they were cheap and he shouldn't stress. Then Alicia twitched, sat up a little, and the damage faded fast and the relief hit him like a wave. Now that Alicia was finally stable, he sank into a deep bow to Baskerville, thanking him with all his heart, not just for the healing drugs, but for bringing down that monstrous gargoyle too. Still, Baskerville waved it all off, saying they were classmates. As he replayed the fight in his head, shame crashed over him. He never thought a monster this brutal would spawn in that dungeon, and now he was kicking himself for dropping his guard. His self-attack cranked up to a new level. His knuckles went bone-white as he clenched his fists so tight it hurt. He swore to himself that if he'd only been stronger, none of his friends would have died, and they wouldn't have been dragged into something this horrific. Baskerville watched it all unfold, clocking every painful ounce of his self-blame. Baskerville then leaned in and told him, if you truly feel responsible, get stronger so you can protect your friends next time. Inside, Baskerville couldn't help but think this guy's sense of duty was way too intense, like it belonged to someone far bigger than a background character. He took Baskerville's words to heart and finally saw the truth in them, then swore he'd get stronger just like him. Baskerville then brushed it off with humility, saying he didn't need to be treated like some shining example because just giving his best every day in academy life was plenty. Then he spun toward Baskerville, admitting he'd totally misread him and promising a real apology, not a half-baked one. Baskerville said he'd already heard about the annoyance, but he still accepted it. He admitted that at first he'd pegged Baskerville as a straight-up monster, just look at that scary face and the family's awful reputation, but now he finally got it. Baskerville was actually a good guy all along. Baskerville only smirked like he already knew. Yeah, I know that. His mind flashed back to Baskerville's selfless moves, how he could have walked away, but instead sprinted straight into danger to protect everyone, even handing over his precious healing potions. Then it hit him. He and the others had blown Baskerville off in class. Remorse crushed him and he bowed again, this time admitting he'd been dead wrong and begging for forgiveness. He stared back at his past judgments and finally saw it. Baskerville's face looked scary to everyone else, but it hid the real guy beneath. Heat of embarrassment crashed over him because this was the first time he'd actually talked to a classmate since he'd gone lone wolf. Just as he stood there, the protagonist cleared his throat, handed him something small, and said, "Here." Right then, the protagonist _1 slid him a tiny, fancy censer and said it was packed with monster-repelling incense magic, telling character _1 to use it and slow down as he makes his way out of the dungeon. He said the incense was the real deal, right there for the weaker enemies you'll usually find in this dungeon, not for the stronger ones. Character Runners 3 beamed with real gratitude and swore he'd repay this favor, admitting he'd racked up the debt to protagonist _1 way too many times already. The protagonist just smirked, flashed a thumbs up, and told him the repayment could wait right up until he finally succeeded. With a lazy "see ya," he sent the character under free on his way, and up above them, shadowy, wolf-like monsters prowled and crackled with raw energy. The trail shoved them deeper and deeper into the dungeon, until they finally hit the playground of the wise, the very bottom floor. Deep in the dungeon, the rest of the group huddled in tense silence until a figure burst out of a doorway's shadows and character _A snapped, "Baskerville," in pure shock. Protagonist 1 staggered in, disheveled but totally fine, and snapped, "Are we all okay?" Then character _E clocked him, nodded, and said the kind of toughness he showed was exactly what you'd expect from the hero's descendant. Still shaking from that shock, character _A snapped, demanding to know if protagonist _1 caused their mess, and how he somehow knew they were in danger. Protagonist shrugged it off and said he had no idea what they were even mad about. He just figured they'd stumbled into the same brutal monster he'd fought earlier. Shaken by the brutal attack, Leon dropped into his hands and drowned in guilt, eyes squeezed shut. Then Nagisa marched up, stunned that he'd crawled out of the monster's assault unscathed, calling it a miracle. Leon nodded, relieved he was okay, but his face twisted as he groaned over the injured classmates, because deep down he knew it was his failure that let them get hurt. As Leon's despair crashed over him, Seal clung to him and wept, telling him through shaking tears that none of it was his fault, because without his protection, both she and Nagisa would have surely died. His screams ripped through the air, and the more he cried, the heavier the anguish got, because in his heart he kept blaming himself, convinced that if he'd truly wiped out the monster, their classmates would have lived. He slammed his fist tight and declared it with raw certainty. He was utterly powerless. Then a bitter thought stabbed him. How could he, the so-called descendant of a hero, be this weak? Alicia stared at him face heavy, while Nagisa, still right there, muttered a pissed-off "damn it." Leon stayed hunched, drowning in despair, and G, watching from afar, just called out, "Leon." Meanwhile, over there, the protagonist just stood there, chin in hand, staring off like he was bracing himself to read the next move in the chaos unfolding. Leon, Alicia, and Seal slammed back into the group and knelt side by side, their faces twisted with pure dread, and in Leon's original timeline, that exact moment, letting the enemy slip away, came back to haunt him so hard it ultimately got a classmate killed. The protagonist stood alone in a colossal, echoing hall and stared up at the ceiling like it held the answers, while the chronicler wrestled with what the changed timeline truly meant. If all this had already been rewritten, would Leon still grow the way he did before, or would he take a totally different path in this new world? Leon, battered and bleeding, drove his fist into the ground, his face twisted in raw self-hatred. Then he spat out curses at his own weakness, refusing to forgive himself for how he looked right now. As he dropped to his knees, battered and bruised, Alicia snapped him back to reality. He'd still pulled them through, even with the damage. Nagisa knelt right beside him and begged him to stop beating himself up, because if he hadn't stepped in, she and the other classmates would have paid a far harsher price. He just watched it all unfold with a grim, serious stare. The protagonist kept watching, locked in on Leon's future, and admitted he couldn't predict how Leon would change from here, so he zeroed in on the only thing he could control right now. Moments later, the protagonist swung back to Leon and asked, "Do you still need anything?" Then he straight up said it was time to go, warning Leon to watch his step on the way back. He blurted that they had to move now, pushing Leon to get every last word out, and Leon, shaken to the core, only managed a soft, heartfelt "thank you." Leon then dropped into a deep bow, thanking the protagonist for scrubbing up his mess and getting medicine to the injured classmates, and the protagonist stared back, stunned at the sudden humility from someone who'd been nothing but hostile before. Leon's cheeks went red as he blurted out a warning, "Don't you dare misunderstand what's mine," while the protagonist just thought, "Yep, Leon's headed exactly where fate already picked." He stormed off, venom dripping from every word, swearing he'd never forgive a wicked soul like the protagonist, and that evil would get its due. But the protagonist shouted after him, begging him to wait. Shock hit him hard when a young woman with long dark hair and a katana at her hip marched up to him, staring like she meant business, then demanded to know if he was the one who'd just beaten the gargoyle. He flashed a small smirk, dodging her answer and firing back with a question, "So what if it was me?" She smirked, eyes sparking like she'd already seen it coming, and said her instincts never lie. Turns out, like she predicted, his aura didn't match a single person in the whole class. She challenged him to a spar, convinced that the only way to level up was to clash with brutal opponents, while he grimaced inside, realizing the annoying ones were officially on his tail and the nightmare was only getting started as she walked off. Deeper in the dungeon, a towering, ornate throne loomed on a raised platform, glowing with an eerie, soft light that screamed, "This is the heart of the clear chamber." He stood before the ornate throne, spotted a tiny box stuffed with coins, and then the real jackpot, a distinctive medal. He raised it high, and just like that, he'd beaten the dungeon, nailed the mission, and somehow walked out with barely a scratch. He stared at the medal, and the truth hit hard. Sure, the gargoyle was a brutal fight, but just blasting it away wasn't enough. If he walked out without grabbing that medal, the floor wouldn't count as cleared, exactly the kind of dumb blunder a Damboree player would make. Then his mind shot straight to Leon and the others. Did they remember to snatch their own medals? He figured they probably forgot, and he was already ready to offer his condolences, even as he started plotting his next move. He pushed forward, dragging his hand along the jagged stone wall, hunting for a way out as the drip-drip echoes bounced off the tight, enclosed dark. A huge chamber sprawled in front of him, overflowing with glittering gold coins, heaps of weapons and armor, and every kind of treasure imaginable stacked high against the stone walls. He stumbled right into an ocean of riches, coins raining from his grip as he blurted that this was the legendary vault of the nouveau rich, and then it hit him, rooms like this don't show up until a dungeon's been cleared at least twice. The room ran on, and every step uncovered more piles of gold and priceless gear, chests, shields, and strange magical artifacts, glimmering under an unseen glow like it was daring them to strike rich for untold treasure. Among the treasures, a sleek black bag with delicate, swirling designs stopped him cold. It was unmistakably a magic bag, the kind of prize that could swallow endless items and turn a haul into something legendary. That magic bag was a legendary key item, an absolute must-have, letting you stash endless gold and keep the loot from every dungeon you cleared before, like it never ran out. He sprang into the air, gripping the magic bag tight, laughing like he'd just won everything. Because once he saw all that gold and those items, he knew he'd basically become a billionaire and his fortune was locked in for good. Rage flared in his chest. Now it was time to loot everything, and he sprinted through the mess, scooping up scattered potions, staves, swords, and gems, stuffing them into his new magic bag like he was desperate to claim every last bounty. Suddenly, a searing pain slammed into him. He grabbed his chest, eyes bulging with shock and dread. Then vicious, jagged cracks ripped open around him as reality started to twist into something terrifying. He just stood there, stunned, as the cracks widened, and out of that shimmering void, the treasure heap erupted while a magnificent sword pushed through, blazing with raw power, the demon blade, Heavenly Feather Cutter. That blade, curved like a Japanese katana, streaked with crimson veins, was the exact sword he'd carried from his last world, the one he'd hammered for hours on end, hunted materials for, and ordered blacksmiths to forge until it finally outclassed even the late-story monster Holy Sword Excalibur. And then it hit him, pure awe. His beloved sword had somehow slipped into this world too. In this world, he locked eyes on the demon blade, ***, Heavenly Feather Cutter, ***, and power crackled off it like it wanted to explode, because if his skill was maxed out, this could rip through even the Demon King on hard mode, and the fact his personal sword showed up here. That could only mean one thing. That hit him like a lightning bolt. Then he stared at the massive treasure chamber around him, brimming with endless loot, and couldn't stop asking, was this whole place packed with items pulled straight from his saved data? He stared into the distance, brow knotted with hard thinking, because these items weren't random at all. They came straight from the saved data of Dambor, a game he used to play, and that eerie link hit him like a revelation. That thought kept hammering in his head, one brutal question flashing in his mind. Who on earth had planned something this impossible? Amidst the glittering horde, it hit him, this wasn't just some random accident, and he hadn't crawled into Xenon's body by choice. Someone had deliberately yanked him into this world, willing his reincarnation to land exactly here. He kept drilling deeper into the mystery, burning with one question: why in the world did he get reincarnated as a side character like Xenon instead of the main guy, Leon? A comeback that perfect couldn't be random. Something bigger had to be driving it. He had no clue whether a god or a devil pulled the strings, but he refused to stop until he figured out what they wanted from him, and how they even managed to drag his saved data into this world. He burst out of the dungeon, head still spinning with those crushing questions. Then a familiar voice slammed into the air and called his name. It was Aerith the sage, who'd been waiting for him all along. She shot her hand out and flicked a tiny, gleaming object straight at him. "Catch it," she demanded, and he snatched it on instinct. The moment it landed in his palm, he knew what it was: dungeon-clear metal. As he snatched the metal, Aerith clapped once, her gentle smile lighting up her face. With perfect formality, she declared, "Xenon Baskerville-kun, by my word, you've cleared the sage's playground." Behind her, Leon, Seal, Nagisa, and the others stared on, stunned by the sudden verdict, curious about what it all meant. After he finished thinking back on that dungeon run, he couldn't shake the feeling that Leon and the others never even noticed the metal. So he started wondering if the whole thing, even the gargoyle showing up, was just some kind of test. Then Aerith the sage gave him the official green light to hit the other dungeons, praising him for pushing through and beating the boss, but she warned him not to burn himself out, especially after that surprise gargoyle. As he strode through the city streets, he couldn't stop thinking about all the gear and treasures he'd snatched from that nouveau rich's room, but then he realized most of it stayed useless until he boosted his skill level. Worse, solo adventuring kept slapping him with the same brutal limits, and that's when the idea hit hard. He needed companions, plain and simple. He kept chewing on his situation and realized high-level dungeons slammed a hard wall on solo exploring, so he knew he had to level up his skill. But he flat-out rejected the idea of going weaker, weapons included, because he saw zero payoff in that kind of gamble. He kept drilling into the terrifying fallout of weird abnormalities, paralysis, petrification, the kind that kills you unless someone beside you can purify it. So he figured poison might be swatted away with medicine, but companions were still non-negotiable, and yet he still snapped out a frustrated sigh, stuck alone. His thoughts sprinted through every possible way to get companionship. Since Leon and his whole crew weren't there and the rest of his classmates were useless too, it boiled down to only two brutal options. Gamble on shady mercenaries who could ditch him or swipe his loot, or pick slaves in the Slayer Kingdom, legal, owned, and chained under enslavement magic that kept them tied to him for as long as it could. He wrestled with the gut-punch moral horror of buying slaves, something that never sat right with a guy raised on kinder things, but with his life hanging by a thread, he finally admitted with reluctance that he had no real choice. Cold truth hit him like a truck. This world didn't hand out second chances. With that harsh truth burning in his chest, he swore quitting wasn't on the table. He had to survive, and if that meant snapping up loyal subordinates through slavery, then he'd do it, even if it tore his own ideals apart. Ahead stretched a grand slave auction, an unforgiving maze of greed and hunger, hiding under towering, ornate tents that practically begged anyone to buy or be bought. A sharp, respected butler greeted the basketball family's young master, pulled him inside, and slid him a front row seat, right there like he belonged. The young master nodded back with a calm, quiet thank you. He stared at the brutal truth of his road and knew there was no other way. If he wanted to face his father, the kingpin at the top of the underworld, he'd have to team up with the most disgusting slave traders, and he'd need henchmen running under him to make it happen. Moments later, the auctioneer, dressed in a sharp white suit, cracked out the words that kicked off the slave auction, booming across the hall and snapping every lady and gentleman to attention. The auction kicked off and three chained figures were shoved into view, a sickly young girl, a scarred muscular brute, and a dangerously alluring woman. Then the bids exploded. 100,000, 500,000, 650,000, 700,000, and the young master just stared on, face tight with something almost like pain. The first lot fetched $800,000 and the auctioneer practically beamed as the winner sealed the deal. Then the next lot slammed onto the stage. A gorgeous blonde, blue-eyed boy bidding starting at $100,000, and the young master stared at it all, locked in. He sized up his cash situation, grinning because his pockets, stuffed to the brim with gold coins he'd ripped from the nouveau rich, surely had enough to buy himself 1 or 2 slaves. He weighed the perfect prize in his head, thinking a slave who could fight would be worth gold, and then, for a moment, a pricey-looking collector piece of sorts flashed on screen, a detailed humanoid ornament with carved elegance. He pressed a strange relic up to his eye and realized it was God's eye, an artifact he'd snagged from the nouveau rich's room, built to judge what monsters are really worth. On the auction block, chained and collared people sat waiting to be taken, among them a hulking brute, a sickly young girl, an enchanting woman, a calm tall lady, and a hard-faced muscular man, all staring ahead like they carried quiet, deadly secrets. He realized the God's Eye wasn't just some fancy item. It let him study his opponents' fighting skills up close, so he could instantly clock what they were really good at and exactly where their talent shined. He thought that this item would make it easy to spot whether a buyer actually had battle-ready skills, but he shut that idea down the moment he saw someone who only had charm, because that wasn't what he needed. As he kept watching the slaves, disappointment hit hard. None of the offerings had the exact talents and skills he wanted. He knew sure, skills could be trained later, but raw gift, the stuff you're born with, grew way faster, and that made it infinitely more valuable. With a heavy sigh, he spun away from the auction block, scanning the crowd, and it was obvious he didn't like a single thing on the table. Right when he was about to throw in the towel and try a new approach, the auctioneer's booming voice tore through the air, calling out the final slave of the day. With a wild, excited flourish, the auctioneer slapped down the next bid and announced it. An Oni girl from the northern demi-human continent, a rare breed so hard to find it could rival even the Dragon Kid. His eyes shot wide with shock as the auctioneer's words hit him, and pure disbelief flashed across his face. He locked eyes on the brand new slave, this young girl with pale white hair, glowing golden pupils, and crimson horns, unmistakably honest, the demi-humans, and with a jolt he realized she was an Ulza white ogre. Rare, dangerous, and powerful, so he couldn't help blurting out why the hell someone like her was trapped in a place like this. He locked eyes on the Ulza white ogre sitting in that auction block, and then it hit him hard. This couldn't be right. Ulza wasn't even from the world of Dambur. He remembered Ulza first showed up in a totally different war sim, Warriors of the Holy See ***, built by the same crew as ***. That one took place on a South Sea island nation where you teamed up with allies and crushed enemy nations. Ulza was supposed to be one of those key ally characters, so now he couldn't help but stare at her like, wait, why are you standing in Danbury's world? The young master stared at the craziness unfolding, seeing the game's scene lines start to smear together, and he couldn't stop asking what the hell was really happening in this world. While the auction kept roaring, the auctioneer shouted bid after bid as the crowd surged forward, hungry for the rare Ulza White Ogre, because the only one he knew was staggeringly hard to find, aged slowly and swung with terrifying physical power, which made her the prize everyone fought to own. He kept wrestling with his thoughts, convinced this world was either a mashup of Danbury 1 and 2, mixed with the Holy See, or maybe it was the very same world from the start. The bidding slammed into 5 million, so it wouldn't shock him if Danbury and the Holy See were secretly tied together, since they were built by the same company, even if their worlds looked different. Then he snapped on his god's eye and stared at Ulza, reading her strengths like a blueprint. Innate skills, physical reinforcement level 11, super strength level 13, and hammer mastery level 9. He couldn't stop smiling. Every one of her 3 innate skills screamed combat, exactly the kind of talent he wanted. Then trouble hit. If the Holy See world is really tied to that story, would Ulz, who started as a slave and later became the main character's companion, end up matching that same fate? And if he bought her, would it yank him straight into the Holy See protagonist's plot? He stayed locked on the auction hall, his gaze distant as he wrestled with the brutal consequences of every move he might make. The auctioneer's voice sliced through his thoughts, $6 500 000, and he rose with total authority, eyes locked on Ulza, still chained to that platform. With one sharp motion, he shot his hand up and called out a bid of 10 million, fist clenched like a promise, while Ulza stared down at him, eyes popping wide in shock. He shot his hand up and blurted, 10 million, and that jaw-dropping bid froze the room, making everyone stare and whisper, stunned that he'd dare pour that kind of money into one girl, especially when she was a rare demi-human. He mentally clocked the damage. 10 million could have fully loaded an entire party with top-tier gear for a final boss, then regret hit him hard for spending it so wildly. His thoughts sprinted non-stop, wrestling with what he'd just done, because saving the White Ogre right now, before the noble's cruelty shatters her heart, could flip the entire Holy See war on its head. Then the doubt hit. But stepping and rewrite what comes next. He clenched his jaw and couldn't ignore the terrible fate he knew was coming for her, while telling himself the Holy See protagonist could survive a few plot twists, because he just couldn't force himself to turn into a full-on villain like Xenon, right as the auctioneer, beaming, rang out 10 million. And teased, daring anyone to outbid that gorgeous. The other biters froze in pure disbelief, their faces twisted with shock as they stared. 10 million bites, and everyone around them started murmuring like, 10 million. The auctioneer, sweating bullets, stared in with a jittery mix of thrill and fear, while the young man now seated poured out a dark, menacing aura, his eyes flashing with pure, unshakable determination. He leaned back with a smug smirk on his lips, fully convinced his villainous scowl was unbeatable, until the Ulza White Ogre on stage stared up at him, her face caught between shock and a puzzled frown. He looked her right in the eyes and told her she had nothing to fear, but she still startled and struggled to catch up with how fast everything had flipped. He flashed a shaky, comforting smile and told her he was trying to help her. Then the Ulza White Ogre blushed, looking away like her heart was caught off guard. Right then, an older guy in the crowd flashed a smug grin and shot his hand up, calling out a fresh bid for 10 500 000 ***, and the auctioneer froze, completely stunned, stammering through the surprise counterbid like, wait, do we have any other offers? He stared in pure disbelief, eyes bulging when the auctioneer's booming voice slammed down a fresh bid, 12 million. The whole crowd rippled with murmurs, faces split between shock and wild excitement. With a dramatic flourish, the auctioneer declared the only girl had been sold at that insane price, then urged the room to clap for the young man who snapped her up. The young protagonist smirked, shot his hand up, and basked as the crowd exploded into cheers and applause, because yeah, he'd won. Moments later, he slipped off the main auction floor, clutching a tiny ornate book in his fist as he headed straight for a private, curtained corner. Meanwhile, behind heavy drapes in a private chamber, Ulz stood alone, her delicate frame washed in a ghostly glow, as she waited, braced for the arrival of her new master. The moment he stepped in, Ulza snapped her head toward him, eyes blazing with a bright, surprising cheer, and she introduced herself as Ulza. Then, with shocking boldness, she wrapped herself around his leg, practically chirping that she was thrilled to meet her new master, leaving him stuck on a stunned Then she blurted out her rock-solid devotion, swearing she'd love him forever and dedicate herself to doing everything for his sake, and he just froze because back in the Holy See, Ulza had always been as cold and expressionless as a doll. He couldn't stop wondering, was her bright, puppy-like grin really her, or had the past twisted her somehow? Then Ulza clocked his quiet thoughts and asked what was wrong, but he brushed it off and said it was nothing. Still, the truth hit him. This cheerful side was probably exactly who she'd been before she got dragged into slavery and forced to endure all that brutality. Treatment, he realized that if he took her out dressed like this, his already sketchy reputation would tank overnight, and without a doubt, someone would snitch on him. He spun to his butler and snapped that he couldn't haul Ulza back in the state she was in, then demanded to know if Leopold had anything else for her to wear. The butler let out a sly chuckle, like he already knew something perfect was waiting for them in the slave quarters. When the moment finally hit and Ulza had to get fitted for new clothes, the protagonist stepped in and soothed her. No fear, he promised, because he'd be right there waiting. He told her to go with Leopold, but Ulza clung to him like she couldn't breathe without him, demanding again and again if he really meant it, clearly not ready to leave his side. Meanwhile, he stood surrounded by a mountain of clothes, eyes racing over every style and fabric as he tried to find the perfect outfit for her. Then he dropped into a chair, letting a thoughtful slip out as his mind churned over what Ul's transformation really meant, and why she suddenly latched on so hard. Moments later, a voice snapped from behind the changing curtain, saying she was done. Then he hollered at her to step out and show off her new look. Elegant shoes slid out from behind the curtain, and the whole room knew her full transformation was about to burst onto the stage. Ulza tore through the curtains with a bright, happy flourish, showing off her brand new black shoes. Then Xenon's eyes snapped open and he scolded her fast, telling her that shoes weren't the whole job, she had to get fully dressed. Still, Ulza just grinned, thrilled that she finally had them. Xenon was still weighing everything when the butler blurted out a warning: "Don't dare take off Ul's collar, not while that ornate band sits on her neck and the engraved name Xenon Vaskerville is staring back at him, heavy as a curse." Ulza snapped into the truth. If her collar came off, she'd be tossed into the world as an ownerless slave, leaving her wide open to brutal danger, and on top of that, the collar was stamped with her young master's name, proving it beyond doubt. Xenon was the one who owned her. The butler laid out the dangers in brutal detail, saying slaves with no master had zero human rights, full stop. Then Xenon, arms crossed as he thought, leaned in and demanded specifics, asking what exact horrors he meant. The butler then painted a brutal warning: because Ulza is an Oni, one of the treasured races, she's treated like easy prey, and if anyone snatches or assaults her in the street without her collar, it won't even count as a crime. So he basically showed how people get beaten, dragged away, and left broken as proof. Xenon winced as the truth slammed into him, and the butler made it worse. If Ul's property of Xenon's status wasn't unmistakably clear, someone could snatch her on the spot. The brutal truth hit harder. In the Slayer Kingdom, demi-humans were treated like garbage, and in town after town they were nothing but slaves, mostly because the kingdom's feud with the Elven and Dwarven realms made everyone cruel. Ulza, with those unmistakable horns, was 100% a demi-human, and without a slave collar she'd be treated like a runaway, dragged into the same nightmare reserved for slaves who dared to escape. Still, Xenon kept telling himself that he wasn't about to get involved in putting a girl in chains. Ulza beamed up at Xenon, bright and fearless, saying that the collar was proof she was his, and that she loved it, plain and simple. Her honest acceptance totally caught Xenon off guard. She listened while Xenon, still torn up inside, finally admitted that if she was okay with the collar, he'd drop the argument, but even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The butler stepped in and offered to escort Xenon to his room, promising they'd be left alone for a while, so Xenon could finally breathe in some real privacy. He watched the butler storm out, and suddenly he was alone in a lush room lit like a love scene, dominated by a massive heart-shaped bed, so Xenon couldn't help wondering if the butler had completely misread his intentions. Moments later, Ulza, already in the room, yanked off her simple dress with an excited cry, practically buzzing as she announced she was ready to start. His eyes popped wide with alarm as she kept stripping, and he blurted in panic, demanding to know why she'd suddenly started undressing. He shoved a shirt into her hands and snapped that they weren't doing that kind of stuff. He wasn't some lullican, and he had zero interest in little girls. Then Ulza blinked innocently and asked if they weren't making babies now. He jabbed her forehead hard and told her straight up they had to get her proper gear because there's no way she's walking into a dungeon dressed like that. The moment dungeon got mentioned, her eyes lit up with pure electric excitement. Xenon quickly shut down any rumors, making it crystal clear he had no plans to turn her into a sex slave. He bought her only to jack up his combat power inside that dungeon. Even shackled in slavery, she bounced like fireworks, screaming that stepping into a dungeon felt like winning her wildest dream and that she absolutely adored fighting. Her smile practically lit up the room as she bragged about how badly she wanted to smash people and grab everything in sight, and Xenon's own grin. It proved that this was exactly the kind of mindset an Oni, the combat-obsessed warrior race, was born to have. Xenon replayed Ul's earlier words and just couldn't match that cute face with the terrifying stuff she was saying, so he only nodded at her wild enthusiasm, no clue how to respond to anything else. Then he marched her into a gigantic chamber and bam, an enormous, sparkling mountain of weapons, armor, and gear lit up the room. Xenon stood right beside it, already geared up to arm her for the adventures ahead. He said he couldn't outfit the gear himself, but he'd already packed everything, down to the last weapon made for a female companion, just in case a woman ever joined his team, and he wanted to know right then if those accessories and weapons would actually fit her. Ulza, fired up and ready, shot back that she got it. Then Xenon told her to try on the gear right away, promising that if anything felt off, they'd tweak it fast. Moments later, Ulza burst back into the room wearing a fresh, way more practical outfit. A crop top, a short skirt, and arm guards, and she said the gear felt great and super comfortable as Xenon watched her transformation with a sharp, thoughtful stare. Her fresh battle fit came with heavy, sturdy boots and a reinforced collar, locking in the perfect look for a warrior. Then she slammed a massive, spiked club into view, bragging that armor and weapons like this were so rare they were almost unheard of even in human kingdoms. Xenon instantly recognized it for what it was. An Oni's club, the kind of tyrant brute weapon built to smash the fight out of you, knock foes sprawling, and crush skulls in one brutal swing. He also knew where these things came from in the game, usually dropped by goblins, and that you'd need blunt weapon skill to use it right, a move hardly anyone had, which meant this club stayed frighteningly effective for whoever could wield it. Ulza swung that heavy club like it weighed nothing, blurted out that she loved it, and swore she'd treat her master's gift with care, while Xenon smiled and said it fit her perfectly, even as doubt nagged him. What if it was still too heavy for her? With that hard, determined sparkle in her eyes, Ulza vowed she'd pour everything she had into cutting down Xenon's enemies. Club in hand, she said she could crush any foe. Xenon let out a chuckle, totally pleased that she was into it. As she kept swinging that club, Xenon watched her closely, then wondered deep down if every Oni was this obsessed with fighting and how she wasn't getting wrecked doing it. Ulza, fully kitted out, clung to Xenon like her life depended on it and blurted out that she loved him, while he froze, stunned, and demanded answers about why she was so attached after only a short meet, since he'd only picked her up to help him explore the dungeons. She poured out her feelings, gushing that her master was cool and handsome, and that it made her overjoyed to be with such a perfect gentleman. Meanwhile, Xenon heard it all and snorted inside, still convinced she must have been blind because those sharp, angled features of his didn't read hero to him, they screamed villain. He kept stewing in his own misery, remembering how the girls in his class would back away and shriek whenever he cracked a laugh, while Ul's new, tough combat boots sat right in the spotlight. Even while self-doubt gnawed at her, Ul steadied her voice and swore her sincerity, then doubled down, confessing exactly what she wants. A guy with killer eyes, a pointy evil nose, and razor-sharp teeth that could tear flesh like it's nothing, so legendary it feels like only God could exist. She admitted that the second their eyes locked at the auction, her heart screamed love at first sight, like destiny had decided she'd be chosen by such a gorgeous master. Xenon, stunned by the praise that landed out of nowhere, felt something wild stirring inside him, like tears were about to spill, and that was a feeling he'd never had before, especially not after a girl complimented him for the first time. He nodded to her feelings and admitted, I can't swear I'm satisfied, but at least I'm not dealing with you hating me. Then he pushed her to wrap up the rest of the changes fast so they could finally get moving. Azulza, fully dressed in her fresh combat gear, club in hand, bolted out of the room like she couldn't wait a second longer. The butler watched her leave, thinking that the young master's feelings hit just as hard as the boss's, then snapped his gaze back to the door. The butler stepped up to Xenon and bowed, swearing he'd hunt down better slaves for the next auction and wait on Xenon's call, but Xenon was fed up. He waved him off and snapped that it was too much trouble to even bother fixing his wrong assumptions. Outside, the city streets sat hushed under a bruised evening sky, streetlights washing everything in a gentle glow, as Xenon geared up to storm out of the auction house district. As they crossed the city streets, Xenon couldn't help noticing something. Those annoying stairs from earlier were nowhere to be found, and the whole place suddenly felt easy to move through at this hour. He figured it'd take them about an hour to reach home, so they had to beat sundown. Then his eyes landed on Ulza. She had that massive club on her shoulder, yet she moved so light and smooth, like a flipping bunny. Ulza was mid-step when a sudden glint flashed right into his sharp eyes. He clutched his jacket tight, instinct screaming a warning without a single word. Ulza whipped around with a brutal spiked club in hand, and that shock hit him so hard he blurted, "What's wrong?" His eyes snapped wide, and in the next heartbeat he realized she wasn't just sensing it, something dangerous was right there. In the dim glow of a tight alley, 3 terrifying figures crawl out of the shadows and slam themselves in their way. Xenon and Ulza kept walking like nothing could touch them, while the streets closed in. Figures prowled the alleys and shadows hid behind every wall. From the shadows, the butlers stride into view and announce their reunion, and Xenon flicks a look back, smirking as he clocks their ambush, then praises their handiwork. The butler's face snapped into a smug, evil grin, like he couldn't wait for his trap to spring. He erupted into a furious rant, demanding to know whether Xenon really had no memory of him after 12 million Xenon burned on him. Then he compared himself to a roadside pebble, furious that he'd been erased from her mind, only for Xenon to point at him and ask like it was nothing, "So, who are you?" Xenon's eyes widened as the butler's words finally clicked. This wasn't just any guy, it was the one who'd set him back, burning way more money than Xenon ever planned to lose at that auction. He marched up to the butler and demanded to know what a loser like that was doing here, especially with a bunch of scary men hovering nearby. Then the butler calmly apologized, said auctions are a cutthroat mix of winners and losers, and asked Xenon for forgiveness. Even after his apology, the butler's face snapped into a creepy grin as he waved Xenon in, saying it was a fun party and begging him to join. Then, barely under his breath, he spat a nasty slur that proved just how much he despised him. Rage burned in his chest as the butler's eyes gleamed with poison, and he realized Xenon still hadn't given up on Ulza. Then his own loss of her hit like a crushing blow. He turned to Xenon and cut straight to it. Would it be okay if he just took that pseudo-human Ulza? And he made it clear if Xenon went along willingly, he'd only end up with broken bones, but if he fought back, the punishment would be far worse. As the butler talked, Xenon and Ulza suddenly realized they were ringed tight by a swarm of armed thugs in a dead cobblestone alley. No way out. From his high perch, the butler barked the demand again, telling Xenon to hand Ulza over right now. Xenon looked up at him, and even surrounded, a daring, almost amused smirk flickered across his lips as he weighed his next move. Xenon, still young, stared down the portly butler as he nervously chuckled, then asked about pseudo-human, a word Xenon said was everyday back home, yet nobody here seemed to know it. The butler finally admitted it meant demi-humans built with a human-like body, and Xenon couldn't shake the thought that maybe only he'd ever heard the term. Meanwhile, the tiny demon girl Ulza stood her ground with a spiked club clutched tight, rage blazing in her eyes. She couldn't stand the idea that demi-humans were treated like they were less than everyone else. Xenon returns with the butler, and the butler snaps that he'll beat Xenon to a pulp and kick him out. No way he's handing over Ulza. He growls that Ulza is his woman, and he won't let her go, while Ulza blushes hard and melts from how moved she is. Then the butler's rage erupts. He can't stand undisciplined brats and swears he'll kill Xenon on the spot if Xenon even dares to throw away his life. Burning with ambition, the butler stared at the price tag and figured he'd need a mountain of money just to cough up 12 million in one shot, and that meant he was too important to fail, too noble for the world to shut him down. Then he snapped, saying he couldn't hold back. If he could snag the girl, he'd climb even higher. And he swore that offering a pseudo-human as rare as an Oni would charm that powerful someone and lock his spot as their right-hand man. While the butler ranted with wild, theatrical gestures, Xenon's eyes snapped to him, because he instantly recognized the guy as a man from the Quran Kingdom, and he knew exactly who he was. Xenon then pressed the butler and demanded, "Is the one I mentioned earlier the Jitros, the martial general of the Quran Kingdom?" The butler's face twisted in a stunned gasp, completely blown away that Xenon already knew. The butler, still reeling from the shock, stammered and demanded to know how Zenon could possibly know. Zenon just smirked and confirmed he was right. Then the narrator revealed the kicker. The mob guy's name was forgotten, but both he and Jitros were enemy characters tied to the Holy See. Deep in a pitch-black cavern, tons of demi-human girls were locked away in their own cages, each one a prisoner, each one doomed. And right there in the middle of it all was Ulza, chosen to be General Zedjitros's next slave, a sick man who hoards young demi-humans of every race like their trophies. The moment Zenon clicked with the truth, it hit him hard. The butler's choice, handing Ulza to Zedjitros, was probably the exact reason he got promoted into the general's aide position, and that clarity didn't stop there, because he also remembered another tale from the Holy See where a hero saved a demi-human girl and ended up becoming her companion. The butler went rigid with shock, stammering, "How do you know my name and where's my superior in all this?" Zenon stayed cool as ice, replying, "I'm under no duty to tell you where I got it." Now everyone knew who he really was, and the butler's cool cracked instantly. He clenched his fist, twisted his face with fury, and snapped that Zenon would die here and now while the ambushers he'd been setting up closed in. He sized up the butler's subnegression in seconds like it was obvious. And when Zenon clocked that a noble from the Quran kingdom had stepped into his turf, he didn't hesitate one bit before smashing back at the attack that followed. He stared at the mess again and realized, yep, he'd meddled in the Holy See's situation once more, and he figured cutting down the enemy count could only help the protagonist of this story. Zenon spun toward Ulza and told her first job was here, then ordered her to ready her weapon. He even tossed out a small "thanks for letting me have you," and Ulza, gripping her brutal spiked club, leaned in and chirped, "Alrighty." She stood there with an adorable face, but it had snapped into a real warrior stare, while inside she wondered why her master insisted she wait. Right then, Zenon lifted his hand and dragged the ancient grimoire of dark magic into the world. He started chanting, and arcane sigils erupted from the ground around him as he geared up to cast. Then the butler saw it and screamed at his men to kill Zenon fast before this got out of hand. With a razor-sharp, almost demonic grin, Zenon snapped his AoE dark magic into place. Blood carpet, then boom, a raging burst of destructive energy swallowed everything in sight. His dark magic ripped up the earth, and a blood-red carpet burst into jagged obsidian spikes, skewering the ambushers and blasting their bodies into the sky. The brutal assault kept crashing on, spikes ripping into flesh and wrenching gut-splitting screams from the victims, while the butler, caught in that first violent surge, was flung tumbling straight to the ground. Zenon stared at the gruesome wreckage, snapping a hand over his mouth as nausea crashed into him, wave after wave. Then the realization hit, that dark magic wasn't power at all, it was brutal torture, just like the magic his father once threw around. Whipping his head toward Ulza, he said, calm as ice, that only the ambushers still lurked behind them. Then Ulza flashed a predator's grin and purred that she was ready to butcher every last one. With a battle cry that tore through the air, Ulza lunged forward and slammed the spiked club Zenon handed her, aimed straight at one of the last ambushers, who froze in wide-eyed panic as she brought the heavy weapon crashing down. Her strike landed with brutal impact. Her spiked club drove straight through the ambusher's body with a nasty, sickening crunch. Another ambusher watched the slaughter and snapped, cursing Ulza as a monster while she kept hammering forward without mercy. Enraged, the ambusher lunged at Ulza with a drawn sword, barking out a challenge. Then Ulza snapped her spiked club up and slammed the strike aside with shocking ease. The ambusher strained, shoving his sword against her club and begging her to let go, but Ulza stayed locked in, her face stone cold and unmoving. Ulza snapped into action with a savage wave of dark energy and a swarm of bats, then swung her club so hard the ambusher got blasted backward, shriek flying out in pure terror. She loomed over the last ambusher, who begged for his life with shaking hands, and with a cold grin she promised to massacre every enemy of her master, then made it clear he was the final one. Without a single pause, she flung the spiked club like a weapon from a war zone, smashing it through the air straight at the fleeing foe, and Zenon just stared, because that kind of power was undeniable. Moments later, she stormed back to Zenon, beaming and saying the job was finally done. Then Zenon softly stroked her head and praised her like a proud father, and she melted into his touch, totally soaking up the love. With the final direct attacker dropped, Zenon's gaze snapped to the cowering butler, who blurted, "Please wait." Zenon stayed ice calm, said his companions were already gone, then asked what he should do with the man now. The desperate butler blurted that he was a noble of the Quran kingdom and warned that killing him would spark a diplomatic disaster, while Xenon snapped back that the disaster was already in motion the second they attacked him, and this was the kind of noble who wanted trouble. Then Xenon leaned in and guessed the butler had already planned to dump his body and scrub the evidence, so Xenon would do the same to him, plus he should have just swallowed the loss from the auction in silence. Xenon naturally figured he'd wipe out the noble, then realized he didn't even feel a flicker of guilt. This was the first time he'd killed 3 people with magic, and his heart stayed stone cold as dark, swirling energy started pouring out of him. He wrestled with the terrifying question of whether he'd truly turned into Xenon Baskerville, body and soul, or if he'd always been this way, the reason Xenon had picked him in the first place. While the butler kept begging for his life, promising any fortune, Ulza sprinted back with her club and stood by Xenon, and Xenon flashed a nasty grin before saying he sure didn't have the funds to spare. Under Xenon's silent command, Ulza hoisted her spiked club over her head like she meant business, ready to smash, and the terrified butler erupted in a desperate scream, begging her to pause. Her eyes snapped open wider, sparks of anticipation lighting her gaze as she breathed, ready, set, go, and the butler's face twisted into pure terror, his eyes bulging the moment he realized death was seconds away. With a brutal swing, he crushed her spiked club down onto the noble and ended his life on the spot, while Xenon watched with that cold, detached look, only managing, oh my. He jolted in shock. Nothing, absolutely nothing was there, no presence at all. Then he blurted for Ulza to come back, but she was already pulling away, snapping her head over with a confused, "What's going on?" look. His mind was sprinting nonstop because if even he, power growing by the day, could miss something, that was terrifying, and if Ulza, a warrior from a powerful race, also failed to notice, then the danger wasn't just big, it was deadly serious. When she heard his worry, Ulza shot back that she was totally fine. As Ulzi's spiked club hung in her grip, she scanned the street and snapped, demanding to know where their unseen attackers were, while Xenon wore a grim look and hunted the emptiness too, feeling that nameless foe still hovering there. A calm, familiar voice sliced straight through the tension, telling Xenon Baskerville-sama there was nothing to fear, respectfully, right to him. Suddenly, a cloaked, masked figure loomed over Xenon, who crumpled on the cobblestones, a foot pinning his head to the ground. Then the assailant leaned in and barked, "Who are you? What the hell are you?" A masked figure in dark robes suddenly stepped into Xenon's path, and Xenon's gut screamed that it was one of his father's men, sent to tail him, until the stranger revealed they were part of the assassination corps, sworn to serve Master Baskerville, and that Lesbold himself had personally handed them this assignment. Still unsure, Xenon shot back a curt "thank you for stepping in." Because VIPs kept getting jumped on the ride home after the auction, they had to be ruthless about it, so a top-notch escort was always assigned to guard those big-name customers. He kept talking, saying auctions weren't just a way to buy and sell, they were pure entertainment, a huge spotlight where people could flaunt their money for everyone to see. Xenon soaked it all in, understanding clicking into place as he watched the scene unfold. Right there, a young woman was being kept on a leash. Ulz lurked nearby, gripping a brutal spiked club, and Xenon felt the truth hit him hard. Buying a pricey slave without an escort like he'd done was basically screaming, "Come rob me." Yet the masked figure down on one knee on that cracked ground told him no escort was ever needed, insisting the Baskerville family's future was safe in the successor's hands, proving just how skilled this next heir really was. Ulza looked satisfied as he nodded, then told her they were heading home, while in his own head he tossed the assassin's words aside and refused to care about being judged as his father's successor. With the masked figure still kneeling, they wished him a safe trip and then swore they'd deal with that insolent fool's corpse, leaving Xenon slipping out with a sharp little frown. The masked assassin finished with the body, then stared ahead, already craving the next time he'd face the Baskerville Hellhound's successor again, while Xenon, with Ulza at his side, slipped out into the night from that grand building. Later, Xenon flopped onto his bed and let out a heavy sigh, part exhaustion, part sweet relief. He replayed everything in his head, 2 weeks since he'd landed in this world, and today he'd taken his very first life. He told himself it had to be done, felt zero regret, but then the doubt hit hard. Was he just born ruthless, or was Xenon's mind and body quietly steering him? Even though he didn't feel a shred of guilt for the murder, something about it still felt wrong to him, especially because he'd been just an ordinary working-class Japanese guy up until recently. He could understand why someone from a battle-hardened race like Ulza might kill without flinching, but he also knew one thing: if he kept hesitating now, he'd never make it in the future. Still, no matter the reason, he told himself he should be happy, because this new resolve was born right there, in the worst possible moment. He understood that after the nightmare of the monsters in Dambor, the next turn of the road would shove him into cultists bowing to the Demon King, pirates, and every other kind of criminal crawling out of the dark. A lot had gone down, but now, thanks to a trustworthy partner, he finally got to step into the dungeon for real, and he even realized his new power to cut enemies down without hesitation wasn't a fluke at all, it was a legit edge in battle. With Ul's brute power backing him up, survival suddenly felt way more possible, but he also knew solo play always hits a brick wall, sooner or later. He wanted a magic user and a healer because 2 attackers alone left the team wobbling. Still, he told himself the situation was just getting started, so there was no reason to panic yet. Ulza burst into the room out of nowhere, soaked in suds, clutching a towel, and sobbing that her master was needed. She stumbled toward him, whining that her eyes burned and yelling that the maid was bullying her, while Xenon, shocked to the core, clapped a hand over his mouth as a thin streak of blood showed. A towel-clad female slave slipped in behind Ulza and chewed her out for running to young Master Xenon and clinging to him like that, while Xenon, nose bleeding, stared in stunned silence. She kept scrubbing Ulza, but the second the soap hit his eyes, he thrashed and kicked hard at Xenon, who was now drowning in suds, blinking through burning, stinging eyes. Even with Xenon's fight raging, she stayed cool and told him straight up he'd never drag Ulza off because the Oni were famous for brute strength. Moments later, Leviana, now alone in the bath herself, leaned in with a daring invitation, asking the young master to join them, and Xenon's eyes instantly went wide with stunned disbelief. She needled him for being so embarrassed, saying that even the young master couldn't hide his flustered state after all this time. Then a chilling thought crept in. Did Xenon actually bathe with Leviana on the regular, hinting at something way more than plain servitude? Later, Xenon collapsed onto his bed and groaned in pure misery. He told himself this was the only way out, insisting he didn't really want to bathe with Leviana. He just had to do it to stop his real identity from getting out, and with a fist clenched tight, he decided to act fast. Later, once he locked in his choice, he swore he was ready, and Leviana charged ahead, her every move pulling his eyes as he trailed after her. Soon, he ended up in the bath, and Ulza slipped in to gently scrub his hair, tiny hands working the suds as heat crawled up his neck, and he looked totally flustered by how close it all felt. The bath finally ended with all 3 of them sinking into the warm water, bubbles drifting around them like magic. Levi shot Anna a satisfied wink and flashed a thumbs up, grinning because everything turned out perfectly. Fresh from the bath and dressed in striped pajamas, Ulza announced she was going to sleep with her master. Then Leviana stepped in like a wall, saying Ulza's own bed was being made, and Xenon, still reeling, could only stare at the showdown. No matter how hard Levi fought for a compromise, it all backfired. Ulz ended up snuggling right up to Xenon, gripping him tight while he tossed and turned, staring into the dark, stuck sighing and thinking, how am I even supposed to sleep like this? He sprawled in that fancy royal bed, his head spinning from what happened last night. Then the questions hit hard. What kind of brutal ordeal was this new life turning into? When morning finally broke, he replayed that unforgettable bath in his head and swore, hands off, heart clear, that he hadn't done a single improper thing, not even once. But morning didn't give him a break. He was still stuck in the same bed with Ulza and Leviana, and the tired look on his face screamed, seriously, is this going to be every single day? He weighed how Leviana and Ulza might react the second he made his move. Would it make everything easier, or would the worst-case disaster come crashing down? His inner fight raged on. He kept telling himself Ulza was just a kid, yet that tiny demon girl, eyes wide and voice pleading, asked him for a hug. Ulz stood there totally uncovered, arms stretched wide, pushing for affection, so he tried to talk himself into it, telling his own heart he'd only grabbed her to jack up his combat power, not to get wrapped up in cuddly stuff with a kid, and then he blurted out her age, wondering if she really wasn't. His thoughts sprinted in every direction. What if she was older than she looked, old enough that those advances wouldn't be a problem? Sleep deprivation hit like a crash, and his brain basically short-circuited, screaming at him to fight the momentum instead of letting it carry him. Right then, Ulza shifted in the bed, murmuring, "Master," and then, bright as day, wished him a good morning. He stared at her hard, double-checking his gut feeling, and the truth hit like a punch. She was unmistakably just a kid, nowhere near old enough to be anything else. Meanwhile, Leviana started to stir, slowly woke up, then turned to Xenon and asked, politely, if he'd slept well. His face twisted with pure frustration, and he snapped that he definitely hadn't gotten a good night's sleep. He kicked off the day with breakfast. Leviana slid it to him and swore she'd take over the morning scramble right away, while Ulza leaned over the table, eyes locked on every bite. Just before they left, he swung around and called out to Ulza, telling her they were heading out, then reminding her about their chat the night before about going to the academy. She lit up and vowed she wouldn't make a scene or throw a tantrum, and honestly that answer made him relax, because bringing her along to the Royal Academy of Sword and Magic had been the right call. Hell, plenty of nobles and royals showed up with their own maids in attendance. His choice came straight from a new change. School just started pushing dungeon exploring and monster hunting outside the city, so he had to drag Ulza with him since she'd be heading into those dungeons right alongside him. As they pounded down the steps, he snapped that if she so much as stirred trouble at the academy, they'd kick her off the school grounds for good. Ulza lit up, grinning ear to ear, and swore she'd behave perfectly so she could stay by her master's side. Moments later, they rolled out in a grand carriage and the butler waved them off, promising safe travels. Surely she wouldn't stir up trouble since she'd laid her intentions so clearly. Inside, Ulza shoved her face to the window, soaking in the rushing scenery like it was pure magic. Inside the carriage, Ulza kept humming a bright little tune, back turned to him as she stared out the window, and he just sat opposite her with his arms crossed, watching that calm joy like it was the best thing in the world. Then she burst into song, bright, simple, and happy, about heading to school with her master, while he stayed dead quiet, eyes locked on a thoughtful, pensive look. Ulza kept singing, and now her tune chased the endless houses rolling by, while he couldn't stop wondering, what was that strange song, and why did it make her happiness feel so dangerously bright? As Ulza leaned into him, still humming about how much fun she was having, he stared out the window, and suddenly a new question hit him hard. Would it really be okay to bring her along? Ulza's eyes sparkled with innocent, unsettling glee as she sang out loud about killing and murdering, grinning like it was the greatest game ever, pure, unfiltered joy in her face, even while her words turned dark. As the carriage rolled out of the Grand Academy, dread crawled under his skin. He couldn't shake it, the long night still clinging to him like some awful doom was creeping closer with every mile. A grand, ornate carriage rolled up in front of the magnificent academy, and everyone's eyes snapped to it. Out stepped a blonde girl with pigtails and a dark-haired young man, and two students watching from nearby immediately took note. The students just stared as that fancy carriage rolled away, shrinking until it vanished down the road, and then one of them blurted, "That has to be the Baskerville family," and it left the next kid firing back, totally stunned. Within the academy grounds, Ulza, this tiny demon girl, rolled in and instantly set the students buzzing, whispers flying about her adorable face, her horns, and that collar on her neck like, is she a demi-human slave? Xenon, walking right beside her, realized with a jolt that he'd totally misjudged how much trouble her arrival would cause. Ulza, clueless about the murmurs, burst out that this had to be Master's Academy and practically beamed at the chance to come with them, while Xenon, with a quiet smirk, told her to go first. But the moment he grinned, it vanished. He demanded she knew the way to the classroom, told her to stick behind him, and warned her to stay good. Even with Xenon worried, Ulz marched forward with total confidence, pushing through the busy academy grounds and leading Xenon and the other students right behind him. As they neared the Grand Academy, the students trailing behind them started to squirm. Ulz's sweet, innocent face looked way too mischievous to be harmless. She shot a grin over her shoulder, all wide eyes and playful trouble. Ulza comes from the demi-human continent, a place humans never set foot on, raised by a fierce, combat-minded race, so the real question hits hard. Could she learn to play the social game of academy life? She hummed with bright confidence, telling Xenon, just like she always had, that everything would be okay because she'd simply play the role of his attendant, but Xenon let out a low groan and looked sick. She immediately snapped her eyes up at him, worried, and asked if his stomach hurt. He softly patted her head to calm her down, telling her he was okay, just lost in thought, as they stood outside the Grand Academy with a crowd of students all around. Xenon spun toward Ulza, face deadly serious, and told her straight up, "Don't pull anything that'll drag him into trouble, listen to every word he says, and everything stays smooth." As they kept walking, Xenon suddenly realized he'd forgotten one huge thing to say, and the truth hit him hard. Trouble doesn't always start with you. Right then, Leon, brave, young, blonde, and all bite, snapped out to Xenon with a sharp, accusatory voice, and when Xenon spun around, annoyance flared in his eyes as Leon insisted that trouble always comes knocking by itself. Leon Danbury's Justice Incarnate snapped a finger at Xenon and demanded answers. Who was Ulza, and how dare he slap a slave collar on a kid that young? Leon admitted he'd been wrong about him, calling Xenon a scoundrel, because Leon could see the truth. This wasn't some cold monster who turns a blind eye. It was a passionate man willing to throw his life on the line for a girl he just met. Leon kept roaring, saying he should have known Xenon was a total scoundrel, especially after saving their classmates in the dungeon the other day, then admitted he'd actually hoped Xenon wasn't a bad guy until now when he finally saw him as an oblivious troublemaker. Xenon clicked his tongue, and the irritation on his face turned cold as the public accusation hit. Xenon sat there locked in thought, trying to figure out how to handle this sudden mess. Because if the story played out the way it was written, Leon would crush the Demon King and save the world, and Xenon swore to stay out of it, not stepping in or messing with the plot, as long as Leon didn't go and steal the heroines away. He couldn't help but wonder, why was Leon, this self-proclaimed protagonist, the one butting into his business like that in front of everyone? Even while he admitted Ulz was a slave, he couldn't shake the feeling that Leon's anger had something deeper behind it, because Leon was blasting for Ulz's freedom and the poor little demon girl just stared up at him, totally lost. Meanwhile, Xenon ground his teeth, muttering curses at the heavens, because this wasn't how the game played out at all. Reality had flipped the script hard. As the confrontation heated up, Xenon didn't flinch. He calmly told the swelling crowd of students, including Leon and a blonde girl named Seal, that Ulza was now his slave because the paperwork was real, the purchase was legit, and the school's rules allowed it for attendance. Leon snapped back at once, furious, insisting that no set of rules could ever excuse enslaving a young girl, and that it was morally wrong for anyone to treat a human being that way. Xenon watched Seal and saw the same justice in her that Leon had, especially when women and kids were involved. Then she snapped back, asking if Leon planned to seize Ulza by force once he decided her enslavement was truly unforgivable. He felt the legal trap snap shut in his mind. This kingdom treated slaves like property, so breaking one free counted as theft or robbery, and the whole crowd, Seal and Leon included, leaned in and stared, waiting to see what he'd do. Xenon stared at Leon and groaned at his habit of chasing needless trouble, taking the long road, burning through resources. But Leon didn't blink at Xenon's legal shots. He pivoted hard and demanded to know what it would cost to buy Ulza and rip her out of slavery. He couldn't help thinking, protagonists are usually saints to the extreme, and maybe that's the fun of it, like an RPG, where you're meant to savor all those pointless detours. Xenon shot down Leon's offer without a second thought. No matter the price, he'd never sell Ulza, his precious subordinate and attendant. Then he waved Leon off coldly and told him to get out, promising they'd meet again later in the classroom. Leon, furious at Xenon's dismissal, charged forward with clenched fists and yelled that Xenon still didn't get it, calling him a damn idiot. Leon's punch tore through the air straight at Xenon. Then Ulza snapped into action, stepping in front of him and swearing she'd never let Leon touch her master. Xenon clocked the incoming impact and forced himself to take it, because throwing violence at a helpless person in front of everyone would turn Leon into the villain fast. She dropped out of the sky like a storm, tiny but furious, clutching a spiked club and lining it up straight at Leon. Both Xenon and Leon snapped their heads up, stunned by the sudden, violent twist. Her attack slammed into the ground with brutal force, pavement exploding beneath it, and Leon went skidding back, shouting in pure shock, while Xenon just watched with a face that gave nothing away. She didn't flinch. She lunged forward, her tiny frame blazing with pure willpower as she swung her weapon hard, swearing with unwavering certainty that she would cut down anyone foolish enough to stand against her master. He tried to reason with her, begging her to calm down and talk, while he desperately juked every relentless, crushing swing, yet Ulza just kept tearing into him, blasting out fierce battle cries like it was the only language she knew. While she hammered the attack, Leon fought for every breath just to defend himself. Then the blonde student, alongside the others, blurted out to Ulza that Leon wasn't her enemy at all, and that he only wanted to break her chains. Her eyes sparked with unstoppable resolve, and she snapped that there'd be no discussion about it, period. She kept chasing Leon with zero mercy, cracking her club through the air at terrifying speed, and the students around them scattered like they'd seen a ghost. Xenon stared at the chaos, and one thought hit him hard: scary. He yanked his head up like a shock hit him, snapped out of his daze, and realized no way was this the moment to drift. As her master, he had to stop his attendant. As she kept screaming that she'd slaughter her master's enemies, he burst toward her, yelling at the top of his lungs for her to stop and sit down. She stayed locked in her raging assault like nothing else in the world existed, and when Zenon saw Ulza snap into battle mode, he understood. She didn't just ignore her surroundings, she vanished inside the fight like that's what a berserker really was. Zenon slapped those thoughts aside fast, because right then there was zero time to be impressed. He watched the chaos blow up around him, students shrieking for a teacher, begging everyone to run, terrified they'd get caught in the rampage, while Ulza, still locked in her berserker state, kept tearing through the crowd, smashing anyone who came near. With everything spiraling out of control, grim resolve set in. He had to stop Ulza, even if it meant taking the hit himself. He knew Leon, the protagonist, couldn't go down here, so he braced like a shield and prepared to jump in before it all shattered. Before Leon could even move, Ulza let out a terrifying scream and hurled herself at him, slamming a powerful kick straight into his chest, an attack so fast and brutal it was meant to end him right there. The impact slammed into Leon and he reeled back, eyes bulging with shock and pain as the blow's force tore through him. He crumpled to the ground, convulsing and choking for air, fully wiped out by Ul's crushing power, his sword tossed aside as proof of how fast and mercilessly he got taken down. Watching the wreckage left by Ul's attack, Zenon's face twisted with raw horror and helpless despair, while the other students around him shrank back in terror, their eyes screaming shock as the violence kept unfolding. Ulza raised her weapon to finish off the fallen Leon, but Zenon ripped in at the last second, thrusting his hand out and shouting at her to stop. She froze in her berserker frenzy, thrown off by his voice, and blurted, "Are you saying it's time to make kids?" He snapped at the totally baffled Ulza, raging that she was a crazy, out-of-control girl, then yanked her away from the chaos, while the other students crumbled into panic, some yelling for a teacher and others rushing to see if Leon was still alive after he passed out. With Ulz finally calm and clinging to him, Zenon looked completely wrecked, and she kept blurting non-stop apologies for the chaos and the injuries she'd caused. The whole scene turned grim as the other students crowded around a brutally injured Leon who lay perfectly still on the ground, so still it felt like the story might have ended right there, and everyone couldn't help but whisper, "Rest in peace, Leon." Leon watched as two figures hauled a boy on a stretcher, while students nearby traded stories about what just happened. Leon Cohen even admitted he'd resorted to violence, but someone else shot back that a little lady had stepped in, protected Baskerville, and struck first with a counterattack that proved she was the tougher fighter. Outside the Grand Academy, the students kept talking, and before long they all pointed the finger at Leon Cohen, sure he was the one who'd snapped and demanded someone sell their slave to him. And as the crowd buzzed, whispers of Zenon Cohen spread like fire. In the grand hallway, the Academy official hauled Zenon Kun and the Oni girl into the spotlight and made it clear. The Academy wasn't going public to dodge a full-on feud between houses, but he admitted the truth. Leon Kun was to blame, yet Zenon had crossed the line with brutal force. Then he handed Zenon the job of keeping everything calm, and Zenon snapped back, warning the Oni girl that if she ever went berserk again, he'd never bring her to the Academy. He also told the official to make sure someone kept an eye on her, and when the Oni girl rubbed her head, she agreed. Later, inside a huge tiered classroom, students packed their seats and dove into their lessons, and right there, Zenon Cohen and the Oni girl sat calmly too, like they'd finally blended into the school life. As Zenon Kun marched through the classroom, a spiky-haired student named John shoved his way over and demanded, "Do you remember me from the gargoyle incident?" Zenon Kun stared blankly, no memory. Then John turned and shouted at the Oni girl, calling her Baskerville. John kept talking with Zenon Kun and the Oni girl, pointing out how brave Kun started the trouble and how Zenon had dragged himself through a brutal morning, while everyone else nearby buzzed in whispers, saying Leon was loved by all, but Zenon, with that chill villain stare, soaked up every last bit of hate. And yeah, they couldn't ignore it either. Walking around with a cute little girl wearing a slave collar felt like a crime. John leaned in and told Zenon Kun his features were actually pretty decent, so it didn't make sense how he ended up looking so terrifying right as Zenon boiled with irritation and snapped, "Leave me alone, I can't change my face." John just winked back like, "Yeah, but you've already got that face down perfectly." He stumbled into pure chaos when Alyssa, his fellow student, threw her arms around the Oni girl and gushed about how cute she was, then joked that she wanted to keep her like a pet. The Oni girl squirmed and demanded to be let go, and as John watched, he cheered Zenon's rescue like it finally erased all the bad talk about Zenon's bloodline. Her discomfort shot straight into boiling rage and her whole body flared with a nasty, menacing aura, until John jumped in fast, saying Alyssa only adored tiny animals and wasn't trying to treat demi-humans like pets, she was just being friendly. He got it sure, but Alyssa looked completely stunned by the Oni girl's furious reaction. He replayed the whole incident, admitting he wasn't totally innocent. Leon had started that fight that kicked Ulz into her rampage, yet what really burned him was how stubborn her grudge lingered, because the moment John said it, he got the chilling truth. A woman's grudge is a force you don't mess with. Still boiling with annoyance, Elise kept the only girl pinned in her grasp while a teacher's voice boomed down the hall, warning that class was about to start. Days kept piling up and Leon stayed gone from the academy. He missed the next day, then the day after that too. Magic could have healed his body, sure, but that incident had left a brutal mental scar that wouldn't let him bounce back. He figured Leon would need time to heal. After all, who could bounce back fast from something like that? But John shot back, "It's already been a week, isn't that a bit much?" Still, he couldn't complain. With that annoying protagonist finally out of the picture, he'd slipped into the calmest school life ever. He clocked her usual glare, but she refused to close the distance, just clutched her cup and stared at him with pure, unshakable sternness. Moments later, Alyssa strode up to the Oni girl, shoved a dish into her hands, and asked if she wanted to eat. She snapped it up without hesitation. Even the other students, one guy and one girl, jumped in with their own dessert, asking her if she wanted theirs too, and the only girl, now clutching fork and knife, lit up with pure delight at the generosity. She dug into the huge spread and couldn't stop raving about how delicious everything tasted, especially the meat. With Ulz right there, he felt his nasty resting villain face chill out a little, and suddenly his classmates started talking to him more, like the only girl was ridiculously cute. Ulzakin, the only girl, suddenly found herself packed in by adoring students who bombarded her with food and non-stop compliments, calling her eating adorable and even likening her to a cute pet or a hamster with stuffed cheeks, until she snapped back, furious, begging them not to treat her like some helpless child. Meanwhile, the Grand Academy loomed under the blazing sun, its intricate walls and towering designs screaming centuries of history. Inside, Zenon Cohen sat down with his classmates, including John Cohen, who let out a helpless sigh. They talked about Leon Cohen still not showing up, and John Cohen's whole body tightened as the memories hit, how that incident left Leon Cohen possibly unable to have children, and the thought was downright traumatic. John Kuhn admitted he felt the same doubts about Leon Kuhn's judgment, and then he flat-out snapped that Leon was an idiot for trying to take someone else's slave. Zenon Kuhn just sat there, drinking, listening like every word mattered. Then the story swung over to Leon Cohen himself, this hot-blooded hero fueled by justice, racing ahead on pure impulse, never pausing to wonder what it would cost. That inner voice kept grinding, flipping the game's shiny version of Leon Kuhn against the brutal truth outside. Sure, trying to save a kid chained in slavery could look bold and charming in anime, but in real life, someone who follows their own convictions and won't play by the rules is a nightmare to manage. It hammered the point home. Real life is that easy good versus evil cartoon. It's packed with shades of gray, and pretending you can just label everything black or white based on a hero's mood is downright exhausting. Zenon Kuhn, back in the present at last, shut down his thoughts with a bitter huff. Leon Kuhn was just too earnest and way too clumsy for his own good, and honestly, he figured sometimes you had to look away, let it slide, and play your part like a normal person in society. Over by the table, Alyssa, sweet as ever, kept piling more food onto Ulzakin's plate, while John Kuhn, still chewing, admitted the truth. Yeah, Leon Kuhn sounded like an idiot, but he couldn't believe he was evil deep down. He watched as the Oni girl was finally grinning, belly full and cheeks stuffed between mountains of empty plates, and Zenon Cohen couldn't help but smile at how hard she'd gone. Then his thoughts snapped to the bigger war and he voiced the same burning hope. To beat the Demon King, they'd have to reach a day when they could finally understand each other. He watched the only girl who'd finally blown up in the student ranks, smiling in class and pulling everyone under her spell, like she'd flipped a switch from the girl who used to stand alone. Moments later, he strode down a sunlit hallway, then the only girl zipped past him, skipping ahead with effortless grace, while his mind churned over the same worries that always tangled him up. Then his eyes snapped to the window, where a small group of students had huddled up. Two guys were urgently trying to convince a blonde girl to come with them. Leon Quinn, wavy blonde hair and all, thundered that they'd take the front line, and that Aerith Centria with her blonde calm would be their healer, swearing she wouldn't regret joining the party. Then he even pitched a single quest trial run, yet Aerith hesitated, awkward as she couldn't shake the feeling that jumping into a party full of guys just didn't sit right. As Xenon Kuing kept watching, he finally clocked the blonde student, Aerith Cintria, the Saint of Cintria and an ace healer, and the moment hit him like lightning. This wasn't just a scene, it was a make-or-break recruitment party, the kind that always plays out right in front of you. The only girl beside him bounced on her heels, eyes blazing, like she couldn't wait to know what he was staring at. He remembered this exact scene from before, an eerie premonition crawling up his spine. This was the turning point moment, the one where Aerith would step into Leon Cohen's party. Then boom, someone's hand shot out and yanked the conversation right out of its rhythm. Leon Cohen shot her a determined look and announced that Cintria had already agreed to join his party. Then he grabbed her hand and ordered her to come with him. Aerith Cintria was stunned at first, but Leon Kuhn's bold nerve won her over fast. His actions lit a spark that made her start pretending she liked him, locking in her spot as a real rising heroine. Xenon Kuhn stayed planted at the window, and when the action sparked in front of him, he let out a sharp little gasp, like his heart stopped, because this was the kind of pivotal moment you just can't look away from. The Oni girl kept watching the chaos unfold right beside him. Then boom, the only girl slammed into him from behind, yanked him out of his thoughts and made him blurt out a shocked exclamation. He snapped out of his thoughts when Ulzakin, the only girl, came crashing into him and her tiny frame sent him stumbling. She looked up and pleaded for him not to stop so suddenly, and he grimaced, a sharp wince slipping out like he was still shaken from what just happened. Meanwhile, Aerith Cintria's eyes snapped wide with panic because one terrifying thought hit her like a wrecking ball. Leon Cohen, the one she just joined, didn't show up today. And that tiny, faraway sight of him sitting alone, shoulders slumped and looking crushed, made the danger feel all too real. As word of Leon Kuhn's absence spread, the whole campus went tense fast. Students, even a male and a female classmate, crowded around Aerith, their voices shaking with worry, asking what would happen to the upcoming event and whether Aerith would be okay without the hero there. Right nearby, Xenon Kuhn watched it all unfold, and the question of what he was supposed to do now loomed over him like a weight. Outside the academy gates, Aerith Cintria stood beside Leon with another guy, and the light-haired student was leaning in like he had a deal to pitch to her. He told them his father was a count, close with Aerith's dad, Viscount Cintria, and pushed for a truce, just once for the sake of peace, while Leon watched from afar, hanging on every word. After a beat, Aerith finally gave in. If this was just temporary, she'd come with him. The guy lit up and said they'd head to the dungeon after school and start the briefing. But when Aerith looked down, that small, hidden sadness in her eyes didn't go away. Leon's still tucked inside, watching everything unfold, and he can't stop wrestling with what to do next. Then it hits him. Aerith isn't just anyone, she's noble too. Sure, he doesn't think they're aiming at her on purpose, but their real plan screams loud and clear. And man, the fate of the story feels brutal because the heroine gets dragged off by some random mob nobody. Elsewhere, the other students were whispering about everything that was spiraling out of control, and nobody could bring themselves to laugh at Leon's mess. They stared at the way things were going and muttered that Aerith wouldn't join his party at this rate, and that Leon was just digging himself deeper into ruin. Then Leon, crushed by pure despair, crumpled to the floor, praying this nightmare wouldn't turn into something even worse. Chaos exploded around them, and Xenon stomped down the hallway, fingers raking through his hair as worry twisted his face, while the small girl trailed behind him in dead silent footsteps. In the classroom, John, full of his usual energy, leaned toward Alyssa during the free period and asked if she wanted to hit the Sage's playground with him since he needed practice, and before she could even hesitate, Alyssa said yes. In the background, other students hung around too, some parked on the tiered benches, others standing and chatting like the day couldn't get boring. Xenon watched from afar as Aerith Cintria stood before male student 3 and Leon, and male student 3 jabbered at her with non-stop energy while Leon just stood there beside them, his face screaming pure despair, like Aerith's choice was crushing his soul. The male student kept driving their plan, saying that once Aerith, the healer, joined the party, clearing the Cave King's bedchamber would be a cakewalk. Xenon rolled his eyes and called it a beginner-friendly dungeon packed with rock-type monsters like golems, and sure, their recruitment was pushy, but it still didn't break any rules. Still, Xenon couldn't stand it. This whole thing felt annoying as hell. Swamped with pure annoyance, Xenon snapped that fretting non-stop wouldn't change a thing, so he marched straight to a dungeon himself, sure sitting around was grinding him down and hunting would finally snap him out of it. Moments later, Onigirl 1 flashed an eager grin, looked up at him, and asked where they were headed next. Xenon thought about heading to the sage's training grounds, but the one girl who always seemed to catch everything, ever perceptive, pulled him up and asked if he wasn't planning to chase the girl from earlier instead. He shut the thought down fast, shooting back, "Why on earth would I do that?" She wouldn't back down. She clocked his face like he was itching to chase her, then blurted out, "Are you worried about Aerith?" Xenon froze, stammered a shaky half-answer, and admitted it might be true, but he couldn't quite finish what he was trying to say. Only she noticed it. He could pretend he wasn't watching, but he cared way more than she'd guessed, and she told him, "If you're going after Aerith, we'd better move now." Xenon just yanked her along and snapped, "I never said I was going after her, and nothing's even guaranteed to happen." He kept his thoughts rolling, clocking how that other student tried to recruit Aerith by shoving their noble titles in everyone's faces, purely pushy and not exactly dignified, yet he admitted plenty of students played the same power harassment game. Then he brushed it off, telling himself the Cave King's bed chamber wasn't that hard, and unless they got hit with unbelievably awful luck, they wouldn't need his help. Xenon was dead sure this wasn't his stage. No way was Xenon the villain stepping in. He figured the one who saves the main heroine had to be Leon, because if it was him, Aerith wouldn't just get saved, he'd trip a flag and get labeled as the heroine stealer instead. Across the scene, Leon stood there with a locked-in, determined look, like he was about to charge straight into whatever hit next. Even with Xenon's denials and explanations swirling in his head, his face still betrayed him, pure trouble on his features. Girl 1 saw it instantly, looked up at him, and asked, "Why do you look like that?" He got pinned under a brutal inner fight. He craved to save Aerith, but it felt like he couldn't move at all, and that panic came straight from the trauma he carried from the game, Damburu II. In that world, Aerith's moves, shaped by Xenon's own roleplay, pushed Leon, who'd once worshipped her as a hero, into resurrecting the Demon King purely out of spite. He wanted to fake a blind spot, sure he was tangled up too deeply and had no business stepping on Leon's path, yet the Oni girl clocked him from the shadows, seeing right through her own confusion about her master's heavy worries. Still, an Oni proverb slammed into her head, "If an Oni is troubled, then bite into it first." Xenon scratched his head over that brutal line, and she snapped that it meant one thing: kill and devour your enemies first, details later, no overthinking, just smash them into the dirt, then deal with the fallout. And if his mind still wouldn't shut up, she told him to find someone and punch them. Xenon shot back with a mix of rage and laughter, calling it the most hardcore muscle brain stunt, so dumb it hurt, yet somehow weirdly refreshing. He cracked up, calling the battle-crazed race's motto ridiculous, yet deadly effective at making every worry feel pointless, and then he decided, flat out, they were just too dumb to overthink anything. He admitted with a grin that being an idiot for once wouldn't kill him, especially since Leon was already trapped in bed, so he stopped spiraling over every what-if and every warning sign and figured he'd follow Oni, girl_1's lead and Leon's example at last, then just go with his gut. He even gave her a soft pat on the head, and she lit up instantly. "Yes, master." Even if his choice soured everything, he'd be the one to take the hit, because he didn't know how saving the heroine would ripple out, but he was stealing her away no matter what. Then he convinced himself Leon's misery, getting kicked, botching the flag, skipping school, was all on him, so there was no point agonizing over it anymore. With a fresh spark in his chest, he and Oni, girl_1, marched out of the Grand Academy like they owned the place, determined that whatever happened next, he'd still play villain, save whoever he wanted, and crush anyone who crossed him. Oni girl_1 zipped right beside him and cheered, loud and simple as that. He flashed a decisive thumbs up and shouted, "Let's go." Oni girl_1 beamed like the sun and locked in, "Yeah, that's Ul's master." Next thing they knew, they both sprang off the ground and vanished into the sky, the academy shrinking behind them in a blur. Their adventure dragged them through a sleepy little town until they finally reached a creepy, shadowy cave mouth. Glowing eyes peered out, daring whatever monsters were hiding inside. Inside the cave, he barked, "Let's go." The Oni girl snapped back, "Yes, master." And he pointed out they were standing in the Cave King's own bedchamber. Then a terrifying grin split his face as a hulking golem monster slammed into existence, ready to tear into them. With pure, fierce determination, Oni girl_1 swung her spiked club and slammed it into the golem, cracking its rocky body to pieces. It screamed as it got completely crushed. She tore through the battlefield at blinding speed, crashing into rock-type monsters with ruthless fury, and in her head all she could think was one thing: smash, slaughter, and wipe them out until they exploded into smithereens. Her face lit up with pride as she bragged to her master about her win, and he nodded like a judge who just watched a champion show up strong. Then he leaned in and warned her, "This dungeon drops 10 floors down, and every step deeper means the monsters get nastier, so keep your eyes sharp." And in his mind, he smirked. Her power was exactly what he'd expect from someone who could crush Leon to a pulp. As they plunged deeper into the Cave King's bedchamber, Xenon realized they still hadn't hauled in Aerith and her crew, while only Girl_1's gear actually carved through the rock-type monsters down here, and her ruthless tactics made it feel brutally personal. Suddenly, a hulking stone bear, its body carved from jagged rock and blazing crystals, stalked out of the shadows, and Oni's girl gasped in shock as she clocked the threat, while Xenon just calmly named it a stone bear and assessed its crushing strength. Without a second thought, Oni Girl_1 exploded forward and smashed the stone bear so hard its rocky body cracked apart. She roared for it to open up and spill its secrets, while Xenon stood ready with his sword high and a magic spell poised to strike next. But when the dust cleared, the beast was already gone from his immediate sight. Ulzakin roared and smashed down with a brutal strike, ripping the beaten stone bear monster apart into rubble, and Xenon-kun just stood there watching the wreckage, his face carrying a hint of worry. After that fast win, Xenon-kun realized he hadn't faced a real fight since the gargoyle, barely even time to get warmed up. Meanwhile, Ulzakin was beaming so hard she practically glowed, letting out a satisfied sigh like, "Yeah, we crushed it." Then he wheeled on Ulzakin, eyes hard, and ordered her to hang back for the next fight, waiting for his signal. Because he couldn't let her step into danger, she snapped back with a shocked gasp. He repeated his command like a hammer, an order, no arguments allowed, and when Ulzakin sagged there, beaten down and crushed, all she could manage was a tiny, defeated little sound. Right out of the shadows, a bigger stone bear monster lunged into view, and the whole place felt like it was about to snap. Then Xenon-kun's voice sliced through the tension, daring her to admit she really thought he was so weak he couldn't handle himself without her protection. The monstrous creature lunged, and Xenon-kun snapped aside at the last second, dodging its crushing strike like he'd already seen it, smug and confident, smirk stuck on his lips, because its timing hit exactly when he predicted, and the stone bear roared in pure, furious frustration. He slammed his sword up to meet the beast's next swing, parrying it like it was nothing, and with a sharp grin in his eyes, he said he still remembered exactly how it attacked. He leaned in and studied the stone bear like a predator, clocking the exact move it made right before it launched its charge. The monstrous thing surged ahead with a ferocious roar, and he yanked himself back just in time to dodge its crushing jaws. With a blazing acrobatic leap, he launched over the beast and slammed it so hard the rocky body split apart into a storm of fragments, its head collapsing into dust. He dropped in like a dancer, sword still thrust out, and let out a fierce battle cry as the last of the monster crumbled into nothing around him. With the threat crushed, he calmly slid his blade back into its sheath, and the defeated creature's debris tumbled down like nothing ever happened. Ulza-chan slipped out from behind that big rock with a breathless look of relief, praised him for his raw strength, and declared he was finally worthy to be her master. Then she wheeled toward him and asked, "Are you okay?" He couldn't help but think, "Yeah, my skills are trash, but I know how the game works." So he confidently went solo on a mid-level monster with no magic, betting that crushing tougher enemies would level him up fast and let him blaze through the dungeon. When Ulzakin heard him, she laughed and said his self-talk sounded kinda sarcastic, but she didn't mind one bit. Still, he warned her, "Don't get cocky, because in the dungeon, one deadly encounter can hit you anytime, and right now, their power still might not be enough to clear it." As they push deeper into the cavern, Ulzakin lifts a tiny, glowing orb and grins with wide-eyed excitement, while he studies his own matching orb in his palm. Their trail plunged them into a massive, ancient cave system where stalactites jutted from the ceiling like silent weapons, and it all led straight to the Cave King's bedchamber on the 8th floor. He scanned the dungeon's dark corners, realizing the visibility was terrible, then told Ulzakin to stay razor-sharp. She grinned, hefted her spiked club, and swore she'd tear up every monster they stumbled upon. Moments later, a blast of noise and debris tore through the air as Ulzakin did exactly what she promised. She found the monster and smashed into it with a brutal knockout swing. He stared, eyes blazing with shock and a twinge of alarm at just how savage she was. The road ahead crashed open into a giant, shadowy chamber, its entrance jagged and pitch-dark, teasing that whatever waited inside wasn't going to be friendly. As they came closer, 3 terrified students, Leon Cohen, John, Juan, and one more guy, came bolting out of the cave, yelling that a monster was inside, and Leon shot a finger at them, barking for them to stop. Even after he barked the order, the students still bolted, so he slammed out a shadowbind spell and dark tendrils burst from the ground, yanking all three off their feet and freezing them helpless in midair as dust and debris exploded around them. The moment the students were pinned in place, he shoved toward John, snapped him into answering, and demanded to know why they were running, and most of all where Aerith Centria was. The trapped students still panicked, blurting that a monster they couldn't possibly handle had smashed into them, forcing them to leave Aerith behind and run for their lives. Then he listened, and his face tightened with a sharp, dismissive TCH. A student begged him to let them go, but he shot back coldly that it wasn't his problem, calling them morons as he waved them off. Then he turned to Ulzakin and ordered her that they were pressing onward. As he and Ulzakin headed off, he stood over it. He'd already wiped out most of the monsters in this stretch. Then his mind snapped to the bound students, lucky, and they'd survive until his binding magic finally faded, unlucky, and some monster would sniff them out first. He kept walking, brushing off the fates of anyone who ditched their companions, until his stride faltered and his eyes shot wide at what waited ahead. A colossal, glittering mithril colossus tore up from the depths, forged from pure mithril and dripping with menace, an absolute gigant mithril, built to crush any hero foolish enough to face it. Meanwhile, Aerith Centria, now hidden in a nun's habit, threw everything she had into holding a fragile barrier, but the monster's onslaught made it splinter and crack fast. When Xenon-kun saw the beast, his instincts screamed that it was a dark blade, an especially lethal variant. He shot a quick order to Ulzakin, buy them time, then dodge like crazy, don't go too hard, and she instantly did it, yanking the monster's focus with a shout as Aerith Centria, hurt and sprawled on the ground, snapped her head up in shock and realized it was Baskerville-sama. Xenon-kun whipped his gaze to Aerith Centria, frustration blazing in his face, disbelief right behind it, like nothing had changed since the game. Yet as she kept begging him to flee, she swore he couldn't possibly face the monster. She was convinced, heart and soul, that she was born to sacrifice herself for everyone else, rushing to help the suffering even when it meant gambling her own life. Aerith Centria kept pushing him away, swearing her sacrifice would get Xenon-kun and Ulzakin out, but then Xenon-kun surged up to her, asking if she was okay, his worry spilling out even while she refused to back down. He shoved a drink into her mouth, brushing off her protests, and every week she thanked him, then still begged him to keep running, promising she could buy him time. Xenon-kun was clearly furious at her stubborn habit of sacrificing herself. Rage thundered through his head as her stubborn streak finally pushed him over the edge, and he decided he was done holding back. He'd lay this stupid woman out with the truth, straight to her face. Xenon-kun exploded in fury, screaming at her, calling her an idiot and barking, "Who's even going to listen to you?" Then he swore he'd force her to beg, "Please, save me," because this time he wanted Aerith saved the way she meant it. With the monstrous golem still hammering forward, Aerith sobbed non-stop and grabbed Xenon's attention, begging him, saying plain as day that if they kept going like this, both of them and the only girl would die too. She pleaded for them not to throw themselves away for someone like her, and Xenon, jaw tight, fist clenched, snapped back, furious, demanding to know what she meant by someone like. Aerith stared down, fumbling for words and only managing a shaky sound, while Xenon snapped that her self-esteem had sunk way too low, like she truly thought her own life meant nothing at all. Aretha's unbelievably self-sacrificing heart wasn't random. It was forged by a childhood nightmare when she and her mother got ambushed by vicious bandits. To keep her daughter safe from every kind of danger, Aretha's mother threw up a magical barrier with sheer courage, but holding something that powerful nonstop kept smashing her mana reserves until her strength started to drain away. Even under the crushing strain, Aerith clenches her face in pain and pushes through, because she swore that no matter what it costs her, she won't let the barrier drop or those bandits will surely come for her life next. But her resolve couldn't overpower her own body. Aerith's mother crumpled as life drained out of her, the barrier stuttering like it was about to give up. Then the bandits, panicked by the guards rushing in, barked frantic orders to stop anyone from escaping before they finally bolted to save themselves. Aerith wailed for her mother, but the damage was already done. She'd made it through only because her mother didn't. After that, Aerith started treating her own life like nothing, the kind of person who would gladly burn herself for others. Xenon watched her shrink from life like that and snapped inside, furious that she'd throw away a chance at happiness when it was right there in front of her. He kept pressing his relentless confrontation, demanding that Aerith stop clowning around with her own worth. She tried to defend herself, saying she was just doing her duty as a servant of God, but it only made him snap. Her excuses irritated him. Then he brought up her father and mother, the ones who died for her, and told her she was basically spitting in the face of everyone who genuinely cared by treating herself like she didn't matter. He just couldn't understand why she wouldn't finally see the truth. Then it hit him, those brutal words were meant for Leon, but Leon wasn't there, so he had to spit them out himself. Aerith was crushed, and all she could do was choke out a tiny gasp, her face twisting with pure distress. In a blink, either driven by a sharp memory or a fierce burst of resolve, Xenon snapped and swore he'd crush every miserable twist coming his way, no matter what. He refused to let the heroine die to save some stranger, and he wouldn't let her live with an ounce of heartbreak either, because now he'd been reincarnated and it was on. For her, he would claw his way into becoming whatever the world demanded, hero or villain. His lecture didn't cool down, it kept surging higher and sharper, and he ripped into her like pure arrogance. He called her a loser, miserable enough that she couldn't even make herself happy, then still smugly expected to make everyone else happy. Then he slammed the point down hard. Her life belonged to her and hers alone. No, there was no such thing as a life worth saving if it was just for someone else. And with every word, he barked at her to stop acting so conceited. He kept pushing her, spitting that a weakling should just stay a weakling, cling to someone, sob ugly, and beg for rescue. Then he hit her with the truth. She had goals to chase, hobbies she loved, so if she didn't want to die, she'd better say it out loud. Meanwhile, off in the distance, a golem kept getting pounded by powers no one could even see. Aerith's eyes brimmed with tears as she finally fought her voice into words, trembling from fear, and she asked, could someone like her, who survived by losing her mother, really have the right to beg for help? He leaned in close with a steely stare and snapped, you moron. Then he sneered that needing help is for the weak, so since she was weaker than him, she'd better hurry, bow her head, and beg him to save her. With tears blazing down her face, Aerith clutched her hands together and begged hard for him to save her. He watched her with a sly little smirk, stunned that she still looked gorgeous even with tears on her face, and then the idea hit him, should he try to share that beauty? But he swatted it down fast, like a warning flare just went off, and he vowed it wouldn't get to him. He ripped his focus to the giant golem, still unscathed, while everyone else's hits bounced off, and ordered Aerith to chug a mana potion, promising it would refill her mana. Then he snapped that she had no right to refuse, swearing he'd bring that monster down, and fired back that she shouldn't toss him in with cowards who ditch women, because he had a real plan. He watched Ulza thrash with pain, her face twisted as a brutal, spiked weapon slammed into her, and even the Oni's mighty club couldn't scratch the towering threat. A gigant mithril straight out of his memory soaked up attacks with insane toughness because this wasn't your everyday monster, it was a rare, one-of-a-kind specimen. In Yandere, people swore up and down that there's no such thing as a safe dungeon, no matter how normal it looks. Nothing is ever truly secure, because the game is rigged to throw curveballs anytime, with deadly encounter monsters that hit way above the usual dungeon level and show up on a terrifying 0.1% chance. Each one had skills meant to wipe you out the second you stepped in range, so Xenon, feeling the weight of it all, grabbed the nun's attention and ordered her to heal Ulza, the demi-human right there, while he started his magic incantation. The nun still hesitated, insisting magic wouldn't stand a chance against that kind of monster. He scoffed at her doubts, bragging that he'd mastered these rare, deadly monster kinds. Then he proved it by seeing mithril armor on their bodies or even a single drop of blood on his blade, which confirmed the weapon's one-of-a-kind properties. He told her mithril could shrug off magic like nothing, so every attack just slammed away without hurting her at all, and then he barked hard for her to stick to his lead and do the job she'd been assigned. Even with doubts gnawing at her at first, she caved in, dropped to her knees, and started the chant, summoning brutal buffs like Exhale, Strength Up, Stamina Charge, and Rabbit's Foot, while magical energy whipped around her staff. Moments later, power surged through Ulza like lightning, her wounds knit shut in plain sight, and she shot up, roaring that she still had the strength to fight. Xenon leaned in as the nun stayed on her knees, telling her her real power was healing and support, not trying to become a shield for everyone else, and asking why she'd ever silence the gift she already had. Still, the nun, clearly shaken, held her ground and swore she didn't want a single person to get hurt. Xenon, tapping right into the nun's protective instincts, calmly told her that holding the front line is the vanguard's job, while a healer's only purpose is to patch up everyone who gets hurt. He turned, stared down the towering golem, and felt the truth hit. Nothing he did mattered. Sword slashes and spells alike barely even scratched it, and this fight-on-the-spot death was downright unhinged. Then that steely spark flashed in his eyes as he slammed the decision down. It was time to move forward. Xenon stared at the game's mechanics, remembering every time he'd raged because his skill proficiencies were too low. He knew Danbori wasn't run by levels at all. It ran on what you could actually do. New magic meant grabbing magic tomes, learning the spells from them, then grinding proficiency until you finally earned the right to cast. And right now, he was about to throw out a spell he had no business casting at his current level. Even with lousy skills, he realized magic tomes could still teach you serious spells, yet they'd never fire unless you were skilled enough, and that annoying catch had him hooked. His confidence wobbled as he asked, "So, should we start?" Because there were two different ways to bring down the gigant mithril. He said the first method was pure muscle: stay on the move, keep dodging every hit, then keep slamming the enemy until its durability finally hits zero. And around the huge, lifeless golem, the other students were sprawled out, knocked out cold. Xenon laid it out. No, the real option wasn't mithril magic or some old myth, it was magic attacks. He said that the mithril cancels spellwork. Rumor is a lie. Push the mithril armor with enough magical damage past a set limit, and it shatters, turning that terrifying enemy into just another target. With a fierce, determined glare, Xenon pulled out a tiny dark bottle, game-changing stuff he'd fought for tooth and nail, the kind of info players only ever posted after grinding through the challenge on walkthrough sites. Yeah, it was straight up pay-to-win, a doping bottle. Ulza and the nun stared with wide, shocked eyes as Xenon grinned and revealed the doping bottle could boost his skill proficiencies for a short time. Then he smashed the item to the ground, and a swirling vortex of dark energy exploded from his hand, screaming that his skills had hit max. With power roaring through him, Xenon ordered Ulza to fall back. Then he grinned and announced he could finally cast dark magic spells at the highest tier, just as a massive, swirling magical monstrosity started to assemble right in front of him. Xenon roared with a violent surge, casting the spell called Abyssgate, and he declared that only the Demon King and he could wield such brutal dark magic, while the golem stood there, waiting to get smashed by the blast. The gigant mithril golem, trapped in that horrifying biscuit clench, ripped open the air with a guttural scream as dark magic gnawed at its body, unleashing a surge of raw, unstoppable power. Its mithril armor, once unbreakable, started to split and shatter, chunks peeling off as the destructive force gnawed it from the inside, until the empty void underneath finally showed. The golem's massive body shattered into a howling vortex of dark specks, vanishing without a trace, only shimmering dust left behind, proof that the spell was brutally unstoppable. With the threat crushed, Xenon let out a long, shaky breath, exhaustion spilling from his lips as his hand trembled from the strain. Ulza, though, practically bounced out of his skin, shouting, "We did it, just like my master." Meanwhile, Aerith stared at Xenon, and it hit her. This could be the person her mother warned her about, the one she'd have to give everything to. Ulza, still buzzing with excitement, lunged at Xenon and clung to him with all her might. Xenon grimaced and told her to let go, because the recoil from that doping bottle had his whole body screaming in pain, while Aerith watched with a blush spreading across her cheeks. She tried to speak and almost please slipped out, soft and trembling. Then she faltered as she stared at Xenon, now sitting there, clearly choking on the pain that still lingered. A cold, empty cavern sprawled out in front of them, jagged walls and the cracked floor buried under rubble and tossed junk, like either nature carved it that way or something brutal just tore through and left it behind. Down in the watery depths, a witch traded your gathered metals for special prizes, and Xenon, clutching one of those metals, couldn't help but think it worked just like a game. Metal wasn't just loot, it was proof you survived something deadly. As they pushed deeper through the cavern, Xenon finally snapped that it was time to head back, and the demon girl slipped along in quiet silence beside him while their footsteps softly echoed off the stone walls. Suddenly, a raging whirlwind blasted to life, yanking two students into its wild vortex, while Xenon, Sister Lily, and the demon girl stared on in shock, and Xenon blurted a surprised shout as the students screamed the name Baskerville. The students got whipped around in the swirling winds, begging Baskerville to let them go and break the spell, screaming that it hurt. Xenon watched it all and thought, maybe no monsters chased us, so I should just walk away and leave them to it. Then Sister Lily stepped in and said she'd volunteered as the decoy, which was why the students got split from them in the first place, and it made no sense to blame them now. Zenon got distracted and caught himself wondering if she'd just called them by his. Sister Lily didn't back down, insisting the academy was the one that had to punish them. No student's personal ethics could justify vigilante justice, and Zenon kept a stern face as he nodded, even while he swore the truth still stood. He'd walked away from a party member. She pleaded with him to stop dragging his own name through the mud, insisting he shouldn't have to dirty his hands dealing with people like that. Sister Lily's fiery plea hit Zenon like a jolt, and he weighed what would happen if he left those trapped students behind. Everyone in the academy would brand him a villain, and even his brand new friends could turn their backs on him, because no matter how this mess started, tossing them away as monster bait wasn't something he could live with. While he spiraled in thought, the whirlwind roared even harder and the trapped students screamed in pure terror. Then Zenon flicked his fingers and shut down the idea of him being a saintess, even though he admitted Sister Lily was right about one thing. That mercy was just her nature, aimed at the truly hopeless. Meanwhile, Ulza, another demon girl oozing playful energy, kept admiring her striped satchel, then snapped that she was bored and vowed to start smashing enemies, craving action like crazy. With Zenon and Sister Lily at his side, he finally cracked, letting her beg land, then waved his hand like it was nothing and agreed. Sister Lily's cheeks burned as she snapped her true motives to Zenon. She wasn't trying to save the students at all. She was fighting to protect Zenon's honor, her savior. Ulza hovered nearby, humming with bright excitement, totally missing the careful words being traded. A hush fell between Sister Lily and Zenon as they locked eyes in the cavern, both understanding the truth without a single word. Elsewhere, Ulza was out there grinning with a cheerful scooping up items and crystals from the ground like it was nothing, because she'd already taken down a massive, monstrous creature, and its remains were right there for the taking. Zenon clocked Ulza's cheeky comeback to his earlier order and snapped, "When did you start protecting me?" Sister Lily stared at him, worried. Then Zenon raised his voice at Ulza and told her to come back. Ulza whipped around with a thunderous, "Yes, master," and sprinted back towards Zenon and Sister Lily. When Ulza finally came back, she marched up proudly and thrust her satchel at Zenon, overflowing with crystals and goodies, and practically shouted that she'd scored a ton of items. Ulza finishes her task and pure joy floods her face. Zenon pats her head and praises her hard work, while Sister Lily watches the moment with a warm, gentle smile. Then the crew surges back up the dark, stone-hewn path, hauling themselves away from the dungeon's deep shadows. As they move, Ulza clutches Zenon's arm with white-knuckle strength, her face shoved against his, while Sister Lily strides right beside them. Sister Lily sneaks in close to Zenon and presses her body against his side, sending a jolt of unmistakable discomfort through him. Zenon's face twists in a silent scream as panic slams into him, too close, too fast, and totally unexpected. He digs in mentally, fully stuck on the gentle weight of Sister Lily's chest pressing against his arm, and tries, politely, painfully, to ask her to keep a little more space as they walk. Sister Lily cuts in and says, as a healer, she'll be in real danger if nobody protects her when it's time, so staying close makes perfect sense. Then she reminds him that he told her to do whatever she pleased, and poor Zenon can only groan inside, terrified he might end up accused of molestation for something that isn't even his fault. Zenon, still stunned, realizes Sister Lily is blaming him for his own mouth. She's straight up saying she's only doing what he told her to do. It hits him like a wave. The romance alarms are blaring, and even without her being in an official party, he's somehow stolen her away just by speaking. Sister Lily suddenly changes the subject and asks Zenon if she can talk to him. Then she spills her heart, repeating her mother's dying words. Find your fated partner, give him everything, and never leave his side because that person will be your hero, and she stares at Zenon, wondering if he's the hero her mom meant. Zenon is completely rattled by her words. He blurts in his head that he's no hero, that Aerith's last thoughts were just a wild misunderstanding, and he desperately wants to make it clear. He's the enemy. The witch from the watery depths kept talking in riddles, watching his every move, knowing full well that whether he turned into a hero or a villain was up to his own choices. She even hinted that he might become a hero from here on out. But her voice also snapped with a terrifying warning. Someone is hunting the hero, and that threat will drag the world straight into ruin. But Sister Lily was way too close, and her words hit him like a punch, so he couldn't even take in her deep advice. He snapped back, demanded when she started reading fortunes, and insisted he never asked for life advice. As he spoke, her hand brushed his arm with quiet tenderness, her eyes locking onto his, pure, unstoppable devotion that sent his heartbeat racing. Her grip tightened just a little, and suddenly he freaked out inside, crushed by how intense her feelings hit him. With trembling conviction, she kept pouring out her heartfelt vows, claiming him as the one she'd serve, her destiny made flesh. She swore that if he rose as a hero, she'd transform into a saintess, even a guardian angel, just to shield him. And if he stayed an ordinary man and lived an ordinary life, she'd stay ordinary too, devoting her whole life to him, promising to stand by his side through sickness and health, forever, never wavering. Those wild promises hit him like lightning, stuff he'd never seen in the game he thought he knew. Heat surged across his face, his mind started sprinting, and he panicked so hard he kept telling himself, "Don't stare at her chest," because Sister Lily and Ulza Clungton were both right there. His inner battle raged harder and harder, sweat pouring down his brow as he realized this sudden twist was way more than he could take. Moments later, as they pushed deeper through the dark, twisting cavern, Ulza started rubbing her eyes and announced she was dead tired, so Xenon, clocking her exhaustion, stepped up and offered to carry her on his back. He scooped her onto his shoulders, but the extra weight yanked his stride and made every step a struggle. Sister Lily, always ready, shot in at once and promised to hold him up so he could focus on moving without a single worry. Side by side, they pushed through until they finally hit a massive staircase, rising toward a blazing light that screamed, "Another dungeon cleared." He burst out of the dungeon, and that blazing exit light nearly knocked him off his feet. Then a tiny, sleepy voice behind him muttered, "I'm starving." Still strapped with the drowsy girl on his shoulders, he strode beside Sister Lily, and she beamed softly as she watched them make it forward. His resolve turned iron. He'd never let himself become some pawn to betray or use. He'd fight the script, push forward on his own terms, and make sure the world wouldn't fall apart on his watch. He grinned, pure confidence blazing in his eyes as he looked back on everything. Ulza was here, and somehow he'd even built real friendships, but there was still one more person waiting. Now he had a brand new companion, Aerith Cintria, one of the three main heroines, standing right beside him. Morning light shattered over the city as birds burst through the sky, screaming, "New day's here." The massive gates of this grand mansion hung wide open, flanked by two silent guards who barely moved. He kept pushing forward with Ulza clinging to his leg and Lily trotting beside him, and ever since he got reincarnated as the villain, he's been fully owning his path. The massive city square sprawled out in front of him, proof that the world he was carving was finally taking shape, because as the villain, his real path was just getting started.